Hey guys, welcome back. If you picture medieval warfare as a simple clash of swords and shields, you're missing the most inventive part of the story. The Middle Ages were an age of problem solvers, where engineers, craftsmen, and commanders kept asking the same calm, practical question. How do we win against a smarter wall, a thicker helmet, a tighter formation, or a faster horse? And sometimes the answer wasn't a bigger blade at all. It was a stranger one. Before we begin, a quick, quiet reminder. If you enjoy long, careful history that respects the evidence and takes its time, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next deep dive. And it genuinely helps thoughtful history find the people who want it. All right, let's step into the medieval world, where creativity was often the deadliest advantage. To understand creative weapons in the medieval era, it helps to drop the idea that medieval people lacked technical imagination. They lived in a landscape of constraints. Limited metallurgy by modern standards, expensive materials, slow communication, and the constant pressure of defending crops, towns, and trade routes. Yet within those limits, they produced an astonishing variety of tools designed for very specific tasks. Medieval weapons were rarely about romance. They were about solving immediate problems. How to reach over a shield, how to drag a rider from a saddle, how to defeat armor without exhausting the person holding the weapon, how to project force across a moat, or how to frighten an enemy into breaking formation before the real fight even began. One reason medieval arsenals became so diverse is that the battlefield itself changed. Early medieval warfare in much of Europe leaned heavily on personal weapons. Spears, axes, and the kinds of swords that symbolized status as much as they served as tools. But as fortifications improved, as professional soldiers became more common, and as armor advanced from mail to increasingly complex plate, old answers stopped working as reliably. If you're facing a man whose body is wrapped in interlocking rings of iron, a clean cut is harder than the stories imply. If you're facing a man inside fitted plate, cutting becomes less the point. You begin to care about impact, leverage, control, and the ability to exploit narrow gaps. That is where creative weapons begin to appear, not as curiosities, but as sensible adaptations. Take the humble polearm, for example. Not one weapon, but a whole family of solutions mounted on a long shaft. Medieval armies loved polearms because they were cost-effective, required less precious metal than a sword, and allowed an infantryman to threaten cavalry at a distance. But polearm is only the category. The creativity lies in the details. A blade to cut, a spike to thrust, a hook to pull, sometimes all on the same head. The bill, derived from agricultural tools used for hedging and clearing, became a battlefield implement precisely because it was already designed for leverage and control. In a fight, that hook could snag a shield rim, tug a weapon offline, or, most famously, help unseat a rider by catching behind a limb or around equipment. The weapon reflects a medieval truth. Warfare and labor were not separate worlds. The tools of the field were close cousins of the tools of the battlefield, and medieval craftsmen were skilled at refining everyday forms into specialized instruments. The halberd is another emblem of this mentality. It's often described as a combination of axe, spear, and hook, and that's a useful shorthand. But what matters is why those elements exist together. An axe head delivers strong cutting force and can damage wooden shields or strike with weight. A spear point allows a direct thrust, often the most efficient way to wound through openings. A hook gives control, the ability to pull, trap, and destabilize. In disciplined hands, a formation of halberdiers could do more than just injure. It could manage space, break the rhythm of an advance, and force an opponent into awkward movement. Medieval weapon design repeatedly shows this preference for control over spectacle. As armor improved, blunt force became increasingly attractive. This is where weapons like maces and war hammers come into their own. The mace looks almost simple, a head on a handle, but medieval versions could be elegantly engineered. Flanged maces with rib-like protrusions weren't about gore. They were about concentrating impact onto narrower lines to increase the chance of deforming metal or transmitting shock through padding. The war hammer, especially, reveals a careful understanding of armor. One side might have a hammer face to strike hard surfaces. The other might have a beak-like spike designed to focus force onto a tiny point. Again, the intention is not theatrical brutality but mechanical efficiency. A tool for turning a strong defensive technology into a liability by exploiting physics. Then there are weapons that feel creative because they seem to come from the edge of imagination, like the flail. The popular image is a spiked ball on a chain, swung wildly. In reality, the historical record is more cautious than modern fantasy. Some flexible weapons existed, and certain forms likely saw use, especially in regions and contexts where adaptation from agricultural threshing tools made sense. But even the idea of flexibility points to a medieval problem. Shields and parries can be predictably strong against rigid weapons. A weapon with a flexible element can, in theory, wrap around a defense or strike from a less expected angle. Whether or not the most dramatic versions were common, the underlying principle is unmistakably medieval. If a defense becomes standard, people look for ways around it, even if the solution introduces new risks to the user. On the projectile side, few medieval weapons show creativity as clearly as the crossbow. The crossbow is sometimes framed as a shortcut, less training than a longbow, more mechanical advantage. But mechanical advantage is precisely the point, and it's a medieval masterpiece. By storing energy in a prod and using a spanning device, sometimes a simple belt hook, sometimes a lever, sometimes a windlass, crossbowmen could launch bolts with significant force, with a weapon that could be held at the ready more easily than a drawn bow. The crossbow changed tactics. It could threaten armored targets, it could be used behind cover, and it could be taught to soldiers who were not lifelong archers. In sieges, on city walls, in the hands of mercenaries, the crossbow became a practical answer to the economics of war. How do you turn money and materials into battlefield effectiveness? The same siege environment produced weapons that were creative on an architectural scale. The trebuchet is an engineer's weapon, less about individual skill and more about coordinated labor, timber, rope, and mathematics learned through experience. Counterweight trebuchets, in particular, convert gravitational potential into a powerful, repeatable launch, capable of hurling stones to batter walls or disrupt defenders. Their presence tells you what medieval war often was: long, patient, and logistical. A siege is not decided only by courage. It is decided by supply lines, morale, disease, weather, and the capacity to build. Siege engines were creative not because they were eccentric, but because they were systems, machines that demanded planning, carpentry, leadership, and time. And they were used alongside less famous but equally clever tools. Mantlets to protect advancing troops, sappers' equipment to undermine foundations, and mobile towers designed to bring fighters level with battlements. Another category of medieval ingenuity is defensive weaponry. because defense can be offensive when it shapes the fight. Consider the pavis, a large shield often associated with crossbowmen. It's easy to see it as passive protection, but in practice it could be deployed to create temporary fortification in open ground, allowing missile troops to operate with reduced risk while they reloaded. That changes how an army can hold a position, how it can approach a wall, and how it can maintain pressure. Medieval combat, especially in sieges, is full of these small inventions that don't look like weapons in the heroic sense, yet determine outcomes. As the medieval period advanced, the boundaries between medieval and early modern technology blurred, and gunpowder weapons entered the landscape. Early handheld firearms, handguns, and primitive arquebus were not immediately superior in every way, but they introduced a new kind of battlefield creativity, chemical energy replacing muscle and elastic tension. These early guns were often slow, temperamental, and inaccurate compared to later standards, yet they carried psychological and tactical weight. Their noise, smoke, and the potential to threaten armor altered how troops perceived danger and how commanders imagined the future. Over time, firearms would help push armor into a different role, changing not just weapons but economics, training, and state power. What begins as a strange tube on a stick becomes, gradually, part of a larger transformation. Warfare tied ever more tightly to manufacturing and centralized resources. Even when medieval weapons look exotic, they often reflect familiar pressures. Cavalry dominance encouraged anti-cavalry solutions. Longer pikes, sharpened stakes, coordinated formations that could withstand a charge. Shield walls and tight infantry blocks encouraged tools that could pry, hook, or strike down into gaps. Fortified towns encouraged engineers and patience. And throughout, there is a constant negotiation between what is ideal and what is affordable. A perfectly fitted suit of plate is not the medieval norm for every soldier. It is expensive, status-laden, and dependent on skilled labor. Therefore, weapons and tactics had to operate across a mixed battlefield of wealth and poverty, old and new equipment, and varied training levels. Creative weapons often sit exactly at that intersection. They are clever enough to matter, but simple enough to produce. What's also striking is how many creative medieval weapons are really about making human strength more effective. A long shaft turns a man's arms into leverage. A hook turns a swing into control. A spanning device turns slow effort into stored energy. A counterweight turns gravity into force. Medieval warfare rewarded those who could translate the ordinary into the decisive, who could take wood, iron, rope, and time, and shape them into an advantage. And there is one final point that's easy to miss if we focus only on the objects. Medieval weapons were embedded in institutions and habits, guilds, workshops, arsenals, and the growth of professional soldiery. As kingdoms and cities learned to store, standardize, and distribute arms, creativity could spread. A design that worked in one region could be imitated, refined, and adapted elsewhere. That process, slow, uneven, but real, is part of why the medieval era, far from being static, is a long story of experimentation. So when we say creative weapons of the medieval era, we're not just talking about strange shapes hanging in museums. We're talking about a civilization under pressure, making choices. A world where a farmer's billhook could become a soldier's tool, where a blacksmith's understanding of metal could change the fate of a knight, where a carpenter's frame could bring down a wall, and where new technologies, mechanical and chemical, began to reshape what power looked like. In the next part, we'll move from the weapons themselves to the settings that made them necessary. The castle wall, the open field, the narrow bridge, the city gate, and the disciplined formation. Because medieval creativity wasn't random. It was directed. It was shaped by terrain, by politics, by money, by fear, and by the quiet determination to endure. When we shift our attention from the objects themselves to the environments in which they were used, medieval weapons become even more intelligible. A weapon is never just an isolated tool. It is an answer to a landscape. And in the Middle Ages, that landscape was often dominated by fortifications. Castles, walled towns, fortified monasteries, and defended bridges were not rare features. They were defining features of political life. Authority depended on holding stone. This is why so much medieval creativity clustered around siege warfare. A field battle might be dramatic, but a siege was decisive. If you could not break a wall, you could not break a rival's power. So engineers and commanders developed layered solutions. Heavy throwing machines like trebuchets were designed not merely to damage masonry, but to exhaust defenders psychologically. The steady rhythm of stone striking stone sent a clear message: time is not on your side. At the same time, defenders experimented with countermeasures, reinforcing walls with earth, constructing angled bastions, or building secondary inner defenses to absorb impact. Below ground, another kind of creativity unfolded. Mining and countermining became a technical duel. Attackers would dig tunnels beneath walls, propping them up with timber supports, then burn those supports to collapse a section of masonry. Defenders, listening carefully through the earth, would dig their own tunnels to intercept. It was warfare as engineering contest, dependent on geometry, sound, and patience. The weapons here were picks, shovels, fire, and structural knowledge. Open-field warfare demanded different answers. The rise of disciplined infantry formations in parts of Europe, particularly during the later medieval period, changed assumptions about cavalry dominance. Long pikes, sometimes extending well beyond the height of a mounted rider, transformed ordinary foot soldiers into a defensive forest of spear points. The pike was not ornate. It was simple and repetitive, but its effectiveness depended on coordination and drill. In tight ranks, soldiers could present a unified barrier that discouraged or blunted cavalry charges. Creativity here was social as much as mechanical, a recognition that organization itself could be weaponized. Missile weapons also shaped the open field. In England and Wales, the longbow became a defining military instrument, not because it was technologically complex, but because it required sustained cultural investment. Training laws encouraged practice from a young age, producing archers capable of high-draw weights and sustained shooting. The longbow's power lay not just in penetration, but in volume. Coordinated volleys could disrupt formations, wound horses, and create confusion before close combat even began. Across the Channel and elsewhere in Europe, the crossbow filled a similar tactical niche with a different labor model: less lifetime training, more mechanical assistance. Both approaches reveal a medieval willingness to balance time, skill, and equipment in pursuit of advantage. Naval warfare introduced yet another dimension of adaptation. Medieval ships were often platforms for boarding rather than long-range artillery duels. Weapons suited to tight spaces, shorter blades, axes capable of cutting rigging, grappling devices to draw vessels together were prized. Fire, always dangerous at sea, became a calculated risk. Incendiary devices, though difficult to control, could turn wooden ships into liabilities. Here again, creativity responded to material reality. Wood floats, but it also burns. In urban contexts, defensive and offensive tools blurred together. City militias might rely on weapons stored in communal arsenals. Spears, crossbows, polearms, standardized enough to distribute quickly in times of unrest. Gates and narrow streets functioned as force multipliers, allowing smaller numbers to hold against larger groups. Boiling liquids, dropped projectiles, and improvised barricades demonstrate that medieval communities understood vertical space and choke points intimately. Architecture and armament formed a single defensive system. What ties these examples together is not novelty for its own sake, but adaptation under constraint. Medieval societies did not have unlimited resources. Iron had to be mined and refined. Timber had to be cut and transported. Skilled labor required apprenticeship and time. Therefore, creative weapons often maximized return on investment. A polearm head required far less metal than a full sword blade. A crossbow could extend lethal force to someone without decades of archery training. A trebuchet, though resource-intensive, could achieve strategic results that justified months of preparation. It is also important to remember that medieval warfare was seasonal and political. Campaigns were often shaped by harvest cycles and obligations of service. This meant weapons had to be durable and maintainable. Simplicity could be an advantage. A design that could be repaired locally was more valuable than one dependent on rare materials. Creativity, in this sense, meant resilience. As we approach the end of the medieval period, the gradual integration of gunpowder changes the equation again. Cannons mounted on wheeled carriages could be transported to besiege walls once considered secure. Fortification design began to shift in response, lowering profiles and thickening walls to absorb impact. This interplay, weapon prompting redesign, redesign prompting new weapon, illustrates a continuous cycle of innovation. Medieval creativity did not move in a straight line toward modernity. It moved in response to pressure. Ultimately, the weapons of the medieval era reflect a world negotiating power through material skill. They show us blacksmiths refining impact surfaces, carpenters calculating angles, soldiers drilling in unison, and rulers investing in arsenals. They reveal that beneath the imagery of knights and banners was a practical intelligence. Calm, methodical, and often surprisingly sophisticated. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson. Medieval warfare was not chaotic improvisation. It was structured adaptation. Every hook, spike, shaft, bolt, and counterweight tells a story about a specific challenge and a carefully considered answer. Creativity in the Middle Ages was not ornamental. It was survival. There is another dimension to medieval weapon creativity that often goes unnoticed: the relationship between status and function. In the modern imagination, the medieval sword stands at the center of everything. It is elegant, balanced, and symbolic. Yet, on most battlefields, swords were secondary weapons. They were sidearms, reliable, versatile, but rarely the primary tool of engagement. The fact that they carried such symbolic weight tells us something important. Weapons were not only instruments of war, they were markers of identity. Knighthood, for example, was bound up with equipment. A mounted warrior's gear, lance, shield, sword, and eventually plate armor represented economic investment and social standing. But even here, creativity shaped evolution. The lance, seemingly simple, became increasingly specialized for shock combat. Heavier cavalry charges encouraged refinements in saddle design, stirrup use, and couch lance techniques that allowed a rider to transfer the force of horse and body directly into a concentrated point. The weapon itself did not change dramatically in form, but its tactical integration did. It became part of a system involving training, breeding of war horses, and coordinated movement. As armor advanced into articulated plate in the later Middle Ages, swords adapted in subtle but significant ways. Blades grew stiffer and more tapered, optimized for thrusting into gaps at joints or visors. Manuals from the period, particularly from German and Italian fencing traditions, show techniques where the sword is gripped halfway along the blade in order to use it more like a short spear. This practice, often called half-swording, reflects a practical recognition. Against plate armor, a wide slashing cut is inefficient. Precision and leverage matter more. Even the pommel and crossguard of the sword could be used as striking surfaces. Creativity here lies not only in the forging of steel, but in the adaptation of technique. Beyond Europe, medieval creativity flourished in parallel forms. In the Middle East and parts of Asia, curved blades such as the saber evolved to complement mounted combat styles emphasizing mobility and cutting power. Composite bows, constructed from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, demonstrated remarkable engineering, storing high energy in relatively compact forms. These designs were not accidents of culture. They were responses to terrain, climate, and military tradition. Steppe warfare, for instance, demanded lightweight, mobile systems that could operate over vast distances. Creativity followed environment. Defensive equipment also deserves attention as a creative response. The shield evolved in shape and size depending on tactical need. Early medieval round shields supported flexible shield wall formations. Later kite shields offered greater coverage for mounted warriors. Eventually, as plate armor reduced reliance on large shields, smaller bucklers appeared, designed for close-quarters control rather than full-body protection. Each shift reveals a balance between mobility and coverage. No design is permanent. Each is a compromise between competing priorities. Even seemingly minor tools like caltrops, small, spiked devices scattered on the ground, demonstrate an understanding of terrain manipulation. Designed so that one spike always points upward when thrown, caltrops could slow advancing troops or disrupt cavalry. They are not glamorous weapons, yet their effectiveness lies in simplicity. They transform the ground itself into a hazard. In this sense, medieval warfare frequently blurred the line between weapon and environment. Psychology, too, played a role in creative armament. Noise-making devices, brightly painted shields, banners, and distinctive weapon forms could project power and intimidate opponents. While we must avoid exaggerating theatrical effects, morale has always mattered. The appearance of new or unfamiliar weapons, whether early firearms or unfamiliar polearms, could influence perception as much as physical outcome. Medieval commanders understood that confidence and fear traveled quickly through ranks. Training and discipline were equally crucial. A weapon's design assumes a certain user. The English longbow required strength built over years. The Swiss pike square required drilled coordination. The effective use of a trebuchet required a team capable of timing and calibration. Creativity was therefore institutional. It depended on communities willing to invest in skill transmission. Guilds of bowyers, fletchers, and armorers refined production techniques. Written treatises on combat techniques circulated among elites. Knowledge accumulated slowly, but it accumulated. It is also worth noting that not all innovation aimed at lethality alone. Capture could be as valuable as killing. Ransoms were a significant part of medieval warfare economics. Weapons and tactics that allowed control, hooks, grappling techniques, disabling strikes, could preserve valuable prisoners. This economic reality influenced design and behavior. War was costly and financial return mattered. As the 15th century progressed, the integration of larger cannons into field armies accelerated change. Gunpowder artillery demanded new logistical systems. Powder production, transport animals, reinforced wagons, and trained gunners. In response, fortifications evolved toward angled bastions capable of deflecting shot. This transition marks the gradual close of the medieval military system and the emergence of early modern warfare. Yet it would be misleading to describe this shift as a sudden break. It was a continuation of the same adaptive pattern visible centuries earlier. Across all these examples, one theme remains constant. Medieval weapons were creative because medieval societies were observant. They studied what worked and what failed. They borrowed ideas across regions through trade, conquest, and diplomacy. They adjusted tools to fit evolving armor, shifting formations, and changing political structures. Creativity was cumulative. When we look back at the medieval era through its weapons, we see more than instruments of conflict. We see craftsmanship, organization, experimentation, and a steady conversation between offense and defense. The weapons may appear exotic to modern eyes, but their logic is familiar. Identify the problem, work within constraints, and refine until the solution is reliable. And that quiet, persistent refinement is perhaps the most creative act of all. As we draw the lens back even further, it becomes clear that medieval weapons were not isolated bursts of invention, but part of a long continuum of inherited knowledge. Medieval craftsmen did not begin from nothing. They inherited Roman metallurgy, Germanic blade traditions, steppe archery techniques, and Mediterranean naval practices. What makes the medieval period distinctive is not that it invented warfare, but that it recombined older elements under new political and economic realities. After the fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, Europe did not lose technical skill so much as reorganize it. Localized power meant localized production. Weapons were often made regionally, shaped by available or timber and trade routes. Scandinavian pattern-welded blades, for example, demonstrate sophisticated metalworking in the early medieval centuries. The visible patterns in the steel were not purely decorative. They reflected layered construction techniques that balanced flexibility and strength. Over time, as steel production improved and became more consistent, blade construction methods shifted. The creativity here lies in material understanding, knowing how to manipulate carbon content and forging techniques to achieve reliable performance. Trade networks also influenced weapon design. Contact between Islamic states and European kingdoms during the Crusades exposed both sides to unfamiliar arms and armor. While the popular imagination often exaggerates dramatic technological transfers, there is little doubt that exposure to different military systems encouraged observation and adaptation. Armor forms, shield shapes, and cavalry tactics were studied and, in some cases, modified. Medieval warfare was not culturally sealed. It was interconnected. Climate and geography further shaped innovation. In forested regions, shorter weapons might be more manageable. On open plains, long-range missile troops could dominate. In mountainous terrain, mobility and light equipment were advantageous. The same civilization could employ different solutions depending on campaign location. This adaptability underscores a key point. Creativity was practical, not abstract. Even the economics of metal supply mattered. Iron production required charcoal, and charcoal required forests. Regions with abundant woodland could support larger-scale metalworking. Where resources were scarcer, weapons might be simpler or more carefully conserved. Broken weapons were reforged. Armor was repaired and handed down. Medieval arsenals were not disposable inventories. They were maintained assets. This culture of repair fostered intimate knowledge of structural weaknesses and improvements. Another often overlooked aspect is the ceremonial and tournament environment. While distinct from battlefield realities, tournaments provided opportunities to test equipment under controlled conditions. Blunted weapons and specialized armor for sport developed alongside war gear. These events also encouraged technical refinement. Armorers competed for patronage, experimenting with articulation, weight distribution, and aesthetic embellishment. Though ceremonial in appearance, such refinements could inform practical battlefield protection. Written military manuals began to circulate more widely toward the later medieval period. These texts, particularly from the 14th and 15th centuries, reveal systematic thinking about combat. They describe leverage, timing, and targeting vulnerable points in armor. The presence of such manuals indicates that weapon use was increasingly conceptualized as a discipline. Creativity extended beyond forging and construction into pedagogy. Teaching someone how to use a weapon effectively was itself an intellectual exercise. Meanwhile, the slow expansion of centralized monarchies altered procurement. Kings and powerful city-states invested in permanent arsenals. Venice, for example, maintained large-scale shipbuilding facilities capable of rapid production. Standardization became more common. While individuality remained, especially among elite weapons, the logic of scale began to influence design choices. Simpler forms that could be produced efficiently gained prominence. Creativity adjusted to administration. Religious and cultural symbolism also shaped weapon aesthetics. Engravings, inscriptions, and iconography appeared on blades and armor. While these elements did not alter mechanical function, they reinforced identity and morale. A weapon could carry spiritual meaning, serving as both tool and talisman. Medieval societies did not sharply divide the material from the symbolic. Both coexisted within the same object. As gunpowder technology matured, its integration did not immediately erase older weapons. For centuries, pikes and firearms operated together in combined formations. This coexistence illustrates a cautious approach to innovation. New tools were tested, balanced against reliability, and gradually expanded. Medieval creativity was rarely reckless. It favored proven effectiveness. In examining creative weapons of the medieval era, we therefore encounter a civilization constantly adjusting to pressure, political fragmentation, economic limits, environmental variation, and evolving threats. The ingenuity lies not in singular dramatic inventions, but in sustained adaptation. Every generation inherited challenges and modified solutions slightly, improving weight balance here, strengthening a joint there, altering formation spacing elsewhere. What emerges is a portrait of the medieval world that contradicts the stereotype of stagnation. Far from being technologically dormant, it was attentive and responsive. Its weapons tell stories of blacksmiths measuring heat by color, engineers calculating trajectories without formal calculus, commanders assessing terrain with practiced judgment, and communities investing collective labor into defense. When we look carefully, the creativity of medieval weapons becomes less about exotic shapes and more about disciplined problem-solving. It reflects a society deeply aware of its vulnerabilities and determined to address them with the tools and knowledge available. And in that steady, incremental refinement, we see the foundation of later transformations that would eventually reshape warfare entirely. The medieval era did not simply pass its weapons on to the modern world. It passed on habits of adaptation, habits forged in iron, timber, rope, and patience. As we move toward a conclusion, it becomes clear that the true creativity of medieval weapons lies not only in their construction, but in the mindset that produced them. Medieval societies existed in a constant state of negotiation with uncertainty. Borders shifted, alliances dissolved, harvests failed, armies marched. In such a world, preparation was not optional. It was structural. Weapons were part of a broader culture of readiness. Consider how layered medieval defense could be. A castle was not protected by a wall alone. It relied on elevation, moats, gatehouses, portcullises, murder holes, reinforced doors, and carefully angled approaches. Each defensive layer required corresponding offensive answers. Battering rams were shielded by wooden frames to protect operators from arrows. Siege towers were constructed tall enough to match parapets. Protective coverings, often soaked to resist fire, were added to siege engines. Every adjustment invited a counter-adjustment. Creativity thrived in this constant exchange. The same pattern appears in personal armor. As plate harness became more refined in the 15th century, it distributed weight more evenly across the body, allowing surprising mobility. This mobility forced attackers to rethink assumptions. Instead of targeting broad surfaces, combatants studied articulation points, under the arms, at the visor, behind the knee. Manuals began to emphasize grappling techniques and controlled thrusts into narrow openings. The weapon alone was not enough. Understanding the armor was equally essential. This interplay reveals a highly analytical approach to combat. There is also an often overlooked logistical dimension. Supplying weapons to an army required coordination across distances, or had to be mined, smelted, forged, transported, and stored. Bowstrings required specific materials. Gunpowder demanded precise mixtures. Medieval states and city authorities gradually developed administrative systems capable of managing these requirements. Creativity in this context included organization. The ability to equip hundreds or thousands of soldiers consistently was itself a technical achievement. Even training grounds reflected innovation. Archery butts, fencing schools, and drilling fields were spaces where weapons were tested and refined in practice. Feedback from soldiers influenced adjustments in balance, grip design, and durability. Weapons evolved because users learned from experience. A broken shaft, a bent blade, or a cracked stock was not merely a failure, it was data. Importantly, medieval weapon development was rarely driven by abstract pursuit of superiority. It was driven by necessity. A community facing raids required rapid response tools. A kingdom engaged in prolonged continental conflict needed scalable systems. Maritime republics required naval solutions distinct from inland powers. The diversity of medieval Europe and its neighboring regions ensured that no single weapon type dominated permanently. Instead, there was a dynamic equilibrium shaped by geography and politics. When gunpowder artillery began to undermine traditional castle walls, architects did not surrender to obsolescence. They lowered walls, thickened ramparts with earth, and angled surfaces to deflect incoming fire. The Tres Italien style of fortification, emerging at the close of the medieval era, was not an abandonment of earlier knowledge but an extension of it. It represents the same adaptive instinct applied to a new technological reality. Throughout all these changes, one principle remains consistent. Medieval creativity was cumulative. Innovations were rarely isolated breakthroughs. They were refinements layered over generations. A blacksmith improved tempering techniques. An engineer adjusted counterweight ratios. A commander reorganized formations based on prior engagements. Over time, these incremental adjustments reshaped warfare. And yet, for all the technical detail, we should not lose sight of the human element. Weapons were carried by individuals, farmers called to service, professional soldiers seeking wages, nobles defending lineage. The creativity embedded in medieval arms reflects the hopes and anxieties of those who bore them. Defense of land, protection of trade, assertion of authority, these were not abstract concepts. They were lived realities. In examining creative weapons of the medieval era, we uncover more than mechanical ingenuity. We uncover a society attentive to its environment, disciplined in its craft, and persistent in its problem-solving. The Middle Ages were not static centuries waiting for modernity. They were active, adaptive, and often remarkably thoughtful in their approach to conflict. So when we look at a halberd's hook, a crossbow's spanning mechanism, a trebuchet's counterweight, or a cannon's reinforced barrel, we are looking at solutions born of pressure and patience. Each one tells a story of observation, adjustment, and survival. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy of medieval weaponry. Not spectacle, not myth, but steady innovation, shaped by constraint, guided by experience, and carried forward by generations who understood that creativity was not optional. It was essential. If we step back one final time and consider the medieval era as a whole, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Creative weapons were not rare anomalies scattered across centuries. They were the visible result of a deeper habit: adaptation through craftsmanship. Medieval societies may not have had laboratories in the modern sense, but they possessed workshops, foundries, shipyards, and training fields. These were their research centers. Trial, error, and refinement took place in hammer blows, in measured cuts of timber, in the tension of bowstrings tested again and again. What is especially striking is how often innovation emerged from constraint rather than abundance. A village militia could not afford fully armored knights, but it could equip men with long spears or bills. A city-state might lack vast farmland, yet it could invest heavily in naval design and crossbow production. Scarcity encouraged efficiency. Weapons had to justify their cost in materials and labor. In that environment, overly complex or unreliable designs did not last. Practicality was a powerful filter. The relationship between offense and defense also fostered creativity in cycles. When armor improved, weapons adapted. When weapons grew stronger, fortifications changed. When fortifications evolved, siege engines responded. This was not a single arms race confined to one region. It unfolded across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, with ideas traveling along trade routes and through military encounters. A design refined in one context might be observed, modified, and integrated elsewhere. Medieval warfare was regional, but knowledge was mobile. There is also a tendency to separate technology from culture, yet in the medieval world they were intertwined. A weapon reflected not only technical understanding, but social structure. Feudal obligations influenced who fought and how they were equipped. Urban militias developed arsenals suited to collective defense. Mercenary companies favored weapons that balanced effectiveness with portability. Even religious military orders adapted equipment to suit both symbolic identity and battlefield need. The object in the hand cannot be separated from the system behind it. As the medieval period gave way to the early modern era, the increasing dominance of gunpowder did not erase earlier creativity. Instead, it built upon it. The organizational habits formed around maintaining armories and drilling formations made it possible to scale firearm production and artillery deployment. The conceptual understanding that weapons and tactics must evolve together remained intact. In many ways, the late medieval centuries prepared Europe and its neighboring regions for the transformations that followed. It is tempting to view medieval weapons through a romantic lens. Gleaming swords, dramatic sieges, armored knights beneath banners. Yet the deeper story is quieter. It is the story of incremental improvement. A slightly stronger shaft, a better balanced head, a more efficient spanning device, a thicker rampart reinforced with earth. None of these changes alone appears revolutionary, but across generations they accumulate. The creative weapons of the medieval era therefore reveal something fundamental about the period itself. This was a world that paid attention. It observed failure and adjusted. It borrowed and refined. It respected experience. The image of stagnation does not withstand scrutiny. Instead, we see continuous motion, sometimes slow, sometimes rapid, but rarely still. And in that motion lies the real legacy of medieval innovation. These weapons were tools shaped by necessity, by resource limits, and by the demands of survival. They remind us that creativity does not require modern machinery or scientific terminology. It requires curiosity, patience, and the willingness to solve problems with the materials at hand. When we study the halberd, the longbow, the crossbow, the mace, the trebuchet, the early cannon, or even the simplest sharpened stake, we are witnessing applied intelligence. We are seeing communities translate knowledge into protection, and protection into power. The medieval era may feel distant, but its pattern of adaptation is familiar. Every society, in every age, confronts changing pressures. The Middle Ages responded with iron, timber, rope, discipline, and design. Their weapons stand not only as instruments of conflict, but as evidence of thoughtful engineering in a world often misunderstood. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring takeaway. Medieval creativity was not accidental. It was deliberate, cumulative, and deeply human. As we close this exploration, it is worth reflecting on how the creative weapons of the medieval era shaped not only battles, but the structure of power itself. Control over weapon production and distribution gradually became a marker of authority. Lords who could outfit retainers effectively commanded loyalty. Cities that maintained stocked arsenals could defend their autonomy. Monarchies that centralized artillery production strengthened their ability to project force beyond traditional feudal limits. Weapons were not simply tools of violence. They were instruments of governance. The growth of permanent arsenals in places like Venice or the emerging royal workshops in France and England demonstrates this shift. Standardization, inventory management, and record-keeping became increasingly important. Creativity extended beyond forging metal into organizing systems. The capacity to produce dozens of similar pikes, crossbows, or gun barrels with reliable quality required coordination and oversight. In this sense, medieval weapon innovation anticipated the administrative states that followed. There is also a technological humility visible in the period. Medieval designers did not discard older weapons simply because something new appeared. Instead, they integrated. Pikes fought alongside early firearms. Crossbows remained in use even as gunpowder spread. Armor persisted in modified forms despite the growing power of projectiles. This layered approach reflects practical caution. Reliability mattered more than novelty. Another important factor is apprenticeship. Medieval crafts were transmitted through hands-on learning. A master armorer trained apprentices who absorbed tacit knowledge, how metal behaves at certain temperatures, how to judge balance by feel, how to anticipate stress points. This experiential knowledge rarely appeared in written manuals, yet it underpinned every creative advance. Innovation was embedded in community memory. The same can be said for military leadership. Commanders learned from campaigns, adapting formations and equipment choices accordingly. A defeat might reveal the vulnerability of heavy cavalry on muddy ground. A successful defense might highlight the value of disciplined infantry with polearms. These lessons traveled through chronicles, correspondence, and lived experience. Over decades, they shaped doctrine. It is also essential to recognize that medieval warfare, while often brutal in outcome, operated within understood conventions. Ransom systems, negotiated surrenders, and seasonal campaigning influenced weapon use. Not every encounter aimed at annihilation. Control, deterrence, and political leverage were equally significant goals. Creative weapons supported these aims by offering flexibility, tools capable of disabling, capturing, or intimidating as circumstances required. By the 15th century, Europe stood on the threshold of transformation. Artillery grew more powerful. Fortifications evolved into angular, low-profile designs. Infantry formations integrating pikes and firearms became dominant. Yet these changes did not erase medieval ingenuity. They were its continuation. The centuries of incremental refinement of metallurgy, carpentry, organization, and tactical thought made rapid change possible. When we examine creative weapons of the medieval era, we see more than isolated artifacts behind museum glass. We see a dialogue between problem and solution, between defense and attack, between scarcity and invention. Each weapon embodies decisions about material, labor, training, and purpose. Together, they form a record of adaptation under pressure. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: Medieval people were neither technologically naive nor passively traditional. They were observant and analytical. They worked within limits, but they did not accept those limits without question. If armor grew stronger, they studied its weaknesses. If walls grew taller, they built machines to match. If new powders altered the balance of power, they reorganized society to harness them. The creative weapons of the Middle Ages therefore stand as quiet evidence of human resilience. They remind us that innovation does not require modern terminology to exist. It requires attention, persistence, and the courage to refine yesterday's solution into something slightly better today. And in that steady refinement, across fields, walls, workshops, and training grounds, we find the enduring spirit of medieval creativity. There is one final angle worth considering: the way medieval weapons reshaped everyday life beyond the battlefield. The presence of arms influenced architecture, trade, law, and even social expectations. A society that invests heavily in defensive tools inevitably reorganizes itself around protection. Town layouts, with narrow streets and defensible gates, reflect anticipation of unrest. Rural watchtowers signal the expectation of raids. The weapon becomes part of the environment long before it is ever raised in combat. Guild regulations often governed who could produce certain types of arms. Quality control mattered. A poorly forged sword or a weak crossbow mechanism could cost lives. Municipal authorities sometimes inspected weapons stored for militia use, ensuring readiness. This formal oversight demonstrates that medieval communities treated armament as infrastructure. Just as roads and bridges required maintenance, so did arsenals. Trade networks were shaped by military demand as well. Regions rich in iron or skilled metalworkers gained strategic importance. Timber suitable for shipbuilding or siege engines became a valuable commodity. Saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, key components of early gunpowder, stimulated new forms of procurement and experimentation. Creative weapons therefore influenced commerce. Innovation in warfare had economic consequences. Culturally, weapons occupied a complex place. They were symbols of honor and authority, yet also reminders of vulnerability. Laws sometimes restricted who could carry certain arms within city walls. This balance between empowerment and regulation reflects an awareness that weapons were powerful tools, requiring control. Medieval rulers understood that widespread access could protect a community or threaten order. Even artistic representation contributed to weapon evolution. Manuscript illuminations and later engravings preserved images of arms and armor, spreading awareness of designs beyond immediate regions. While these depictions were not technical blueprints, they reinforced shared visual language. A knight depicted with a particular form of helm or blade communicated status and contemporary practice. Visual culture supported the diffusion of ideas. At the individual level, familiarity with weapons was often part of adulthood, particularly for men obligated to service. Training days and musters were not rare occurrences. This routine exposure normalized technical literacy. People understood how a spear balanced, how a bowstring felt under tension, how armor restricted movement. Such familiarity encouraged incremental suggestions and improvements. Creativity can emerge wherever users engage regularly with their tools. When we examine the late medieval period, we also see increasing specialization. dedicated artillery units required mathematical understanding of trajectory and range, even if expressed through practical measurement rather than formal equations. Gun founders refined casting techniques to reduce barrel flaws. These were not isolated geniuses working alone. They were participants in expanding technical communities. The medieval era's creative weapons also remind us that innovation is rarely linear. Some designs disappeared when circumstances changed. Others resurfaced in modified forms centuries later. The concept of the polearm, for instance, would reappear in various military contexts long after the Middle Ages. Mechanical principles embedded in trebuchets foreshadowed later developments in energy transfer and engineering. Ideas echo forward, even when their original forms fade. It is easy to romanticize the clang of steel or the silhouette of a castle against the sky. Yet the deeper story is quieter. It is about resourcefulness. Medieval societies did not possess unlimited wealth or knowledge. They worked with what they had: iron that varied in quality, timber subject to rot, powder sensitive to moisture, and still managed to construct reliable systems of defense and offense. The creative weapons of the medieval era are therefore less about spectacle and more about sustainability. They reveal communities thinking long-term, adjusting gradually, and valuing experience. Each modification, each reinforced joint or recalibrated counterweight, represents a decision informed by observation. In the end, the Middle Ages offer a lesson in disciplined adaptation. Innovation did not always arrive with dramatic announcement. Often it appeared as a slight curve added to a blade, a thicker wall angled differently, a formation drilled one more time until cohesion improved. Creativity was embedded in continuity, and perhaps that is the most accurate way to understand medieval weapons. Not as isolated marvels, but as expressions of a civilization constantly refining its answers to familiar questions. How do we defend? How do we endure? How do we prevail within our means? Those questions shaped iron and timber into tools that defined an age. As we reflect one last time on the creative weapons of the medieval era, it becomes clear that their true significance lies in what they reveal about continuity and transition. The Middle Ages were not an isolated chapter of experimentation sealed off from what came before or after. They formed a bridge, absorbing ancient knowledge, adapting it to new realities, and passing forward refined systems that would influence the early modern world. One of the most revealing aspects of medieval weapon creativity is its patience. Innovation unfolded slowly, often over generations. A blade profile might change subtly across decades. Armor articulation would improve joint by joint. Siege engines would be recalibrated, their proportions adjusted through experience rather than theoretical physics. This was innovation grounded in repetition. Craftsmen learned by doing, and what worked endured. The relationship between weapon and user remained central throughout. A tool had to match the physical capacity and training of its bearer. Heavy armor required conditioning. Longbows demanded years of muscle development. Pike formations required discipline and trust among soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. Weapons were extensions of bodies, and bodies required preparation. Creativity, therefore, extended into systems of training and physical culture. It is also important to recognize that medieval warfare was rarely total in the modern sense. Campaigns were often constrained by weather, supply, and negotiation. This context shaped weapon design. Tools had to be portable enough for seasonal campaigning. Equipment had to withstand months of storage between conflicts. Durability was valued as highly as lethality. A weapon that could endure repeated use without complex maintenance offered strategic reliability. The medieval period also illustrates the tension between individual valor and collective coordination. While popular imagination emphasizes heroic single combat, the reality increasingly favored organized formations. Weapons like the pike, halberd, and crossbow thrived in coordinated units. Creativity shifted from singular dueling instruments to tools that amplified group cohesion. The battlefield became a space of structured cooperation. Meanwhile, early firearms gradually altered perceptions of status and skill. A heavily armored nobleman could be threatened by a projectile launched by a relatively modestly equipped soldier. This shift did not eliminate hierarchy overnight, but it introduced new dynamics. The democratizing potential of certain weapons reshaped military recruitment and state authority. Creative tools had social consequences. Even as gunpowder rose in prominence, older medieval weapons retained value in close combat and specialized roles. The coexistence of technologies highlights a layered understanding of effectiveness. Medieval societies did not abandon functional tools prematurely. They integrated and balanced them. This careful blending reflects practical wisdom rather than resistance to change. By the end of the medieval era, Europe and its neighboring regions possessed well-developed traditions of metallurgy, engineering, logistics, and tactical organization. These traditions formed the foundation upon which later military revolutions were built. Without centuries of incremental refinement, rapid transformation would have been impossible. In studying creative weapons of the medieval era, we are ultimately studying the mindset of a civilization navigating uncertainty with discipline. The weapons themselves, whether polearm, bow, mace, trebuchet, or early cannon, are visible artifacts. But behind them lies a quieter narrative of observation and adjustment. Medieval people assessed threats realistically. They experimented within material limits. They refined solutions through shared knowledge. This steady process challenges outdated stereotypes of stagnation. The Middle Ages were not technologically dormant. They were adaptive. Their creativity did not always produce dramatic breakthroughs, but it consistently produced workable answers. And over time, those answers accumulated into transformative capability. So when we think about the creative weapons of the medieval era, we should see more than instruments of conflict. We should see evidence of sustained craftsmanship, communal learning, and practical intelligence. Iron was shaped, wood was bent, powder was mixed, not in pursuit of novelty, but in pursuit of security and stability. In the end, medieval weapon innovation tells a human story. Faced with changing pressures, communities responded not with resignation, but with refinement. They adjusted the angle of a blade, strengthened a wall, recalculated a counterweight, reorganized a formation. They learned, adapted, and carried that knowledge forward. And that quiet, persistent adaptation remains the true hallmark of medieval creativity. Before we leave the medieval world behind, there is value in considering how memory has shaped our perception of its weapons. What survives in museums and popular imagination often represents only a fraction of what was once common. Ornate swords, richly decorated armor, and impressive siege machines capture attention because they were preserved by wealth or recorded in chronicles. Yet the majority of medieval weapons were practical, worn by use, repaired repeatedly, and eventually lost to time. Creativity was as present in the ordinary spear as in the ceremonial blade. Archaeological discoveries continue to refine our understanding. Excavations of battlefields have revealed concentrations of arrowheads, fragments of polearms, and damaged armor pieces that tell a quieter story of conflict. These findings demonstrate patterns where volleys were concentrated, how formations may have shifted, which materials failed under stress. In this way, modern research confirms what written sources imply. Medieval warfare was structured and deliberate, not chaotic improvisation. The creative weapons of the era also underscore how deeply interwoven civilian and military technologies were. Advances in metallurgy improved agricultural tools as well as swords. Improvements in woodworking benefited both shipbuilding and siege towers. Knowledge rarely stayed confined to one sphere. A carpenter capable of designing a cathedral roof possessed skills equally applicable to constructing a trebuchet frame. The medieval world did not compartmentalize expertise in the way modern societies often do. Craft was holistic. Education in this context meant apprenticeship and experience rather than formal schooling. Young apprentices learned to judge material quality by sound, color, and texture. Over years, they internalized patterns invisible to outsiders. Such tacit knowledge allowed gradual improvements that rarely made it into written record. When we see a well-balanced polearm or an articulated gauntlet that moves smoothly, we are witnessing accumulated understanding passed quietly through generations. There is also a moral dimension to consider. Medieval thinkers, including theologians and legal scholars, debated the ethics of warfare. Questions about just war, proportional response, and legitimate authority influenced how weapons were viewed. While these debates did not prevent conflict, they shaped its boundaries. The existence of rules, however imperfectly applied, meant that weapon use occurred within a conceptual framework. Creativity operated within moral as well as material limits. As firearms gained reliability and artillery grew more dominant, some medieval weapons gradually receded from primary use. Yet their influence persisted. Ceremonial guards carried halberds long after they ceased to be battlefield staples. Fencing traditions evolved into sporting disciplines. Heraldic imagery preserved the outline of swords and shields as symbols of heritage. The material culture of medieval weaponry left a lasting imprint on identity. Perhaps what stands out most is the resilience of adaptation itself. The Middle Ages spanned roughly 1,000 years, an immense stretch of time marked by climatic fluctuations, demographic crises such as the Black Death, political fragmentation, and expansion. Through all of it, weapon design and tactical thinking continued to evolve. This continuity speaks to stability within craft communities and military institutions, even when larger structures faltered. The creative weapons of the medieval era remind us that innovation does not always announce itself loudly. Often it emerges through repetition, through subtle refinements tested in difficult circumstances. It is measured in improved durability, more effective formations, and smarter use of limited resources. It is visible in the transition from simple mail shirts to articulated plate harness, from early traction trebuchets to sophisticated counterweight systems, from handheld guns to organized artillery units. When we examine these developments carefully, we see a civilization engaged in ongoing problem-solving. The Middle Ages were not waiting passively for modern science to arrive. They were actively experimenting within the frameworks available to them. Their solutions may seem rudimentary by contemporary standards, yet they were precise answers to contemporary challenges. In the end, the story of creative weapons in the medieval era is not only about conflict. It is about ingenuity under pressure. It is about communities learning from experience and transmitting that learning forward. It is about understanding that survival requires adaptation, and that adaptation, sustained over centuries, becomes transformation. And that steady transformation is the quiet legacy the medieval world leaves behind. A testament to human persistence, shaped in iron and wood, refined by necessity, and carried forward into the centuries that followed. As a final reflection, it helps to consider how medieval weapons reshaped the very experience of warfare for those who lived through it. Technology does not merely change outcomes. It changes perception. The introduction of heavier cavalry altered how infantry evaluated open ground. The increasing power of crossbows and longbows forced commanders to think carefully about terrain, cover, and timing. The arrival of gunpowder introduced smoke, sound, and shock into battlefields that had previously been defined by steel and wood. Each creative development reshaped not only tactics but psychology. The soundscape of medieval conflict evolved alongside its weapons. The rhythmic release of arrow volleys, the creaking tension of siege engines, the thunder of counterweights dropping, and later the explosive crack of early firearms all contributed to an atmosphere that could influence morale. Creativity, in this sense, extended beyond physical design. It shaped how fear and confidence moved through ranks. Medieval leaders understood that disruption of morale could be as decisive as physical destruction. There is also a broader environmental dimension. The construction of large siege engines required vast amounts of timber. Shipbuilding for naval warfare consumed forests at significant scale. Charcoal production for ironworking altered landscapes. The material demands of weapon innovation had ecological consequences. Medieval societies were acutely aware of resource limits, and this awareness fed back into decisions about design and deployment. Sustainability, though not articulated in modern language, was a practical concern. Over time, patterns of settlement and architecture adjusted in response to evolving threats. Fortified bridges, bastioned city walls, and strategically positioned watchtowers reveal how weapon developments influenced long-term planning. The creative arms of the period were therefore embedded in physical geography. Towns were not only places of commerce and worship, they were defensive systems shaped by anticipated conflict. Another revealing factor is the blending of regional traditions. As trade routes expanded and diplomatic exchanges increased, weapon styles crossed borders. A polearm type developed in one region might be adapted elsewhere with minor modifications suited to local preferences. Armorers incorporated decorative motifs learned from distant cultures. The medieval world was more interconnected than it is often portrayed. Innovation traveled with merchants, envoys, and soldiers. At the same time, continuity persisted. Certain fundamental tools, like the spear, remained relevant throughout the entire medieval millennium. Their enduring presence underscores a key principle. Creativity does not always mean replacement. Often it means refinement. The spearhead changes shape. The shaft length adjusts. The formation around it becomes more disciplined. But the core concept survives because it continues to solve practical problems effectively. When viewed across centuries, medieval weapon development resembles a long conversation rather than a sequence of revolutions. One generation responded to challenges left by the previous. Each adjustment prompted further response. Armor grew stronger. Impact weapons concentrated force. Walls grew thicker. Artillery increased weight. Firearms improved. Fortifications lowered and angled. The process was dynamic yet grounded. Ultimately, the creative weapons of the medieval era reveal a civilization deeply engaged with material reality. Medieval societies were not abstract theorists removed from practice. Their understanding was tactile and experiential. Metal was judged by sound. Timber was selected by grain. Balance was assessed in the hand. Effectiveness was measured in lived outcomes. And perhaps that is the most enduring insight. The Middle Ages were shaped by people who paid attention to the limits of their materials, to the lessons of defeat, to the advantages of coordination. They were inventive not because they sought novelty, but because they sought security and stability in uncertain times. When we think of creative weapons of the medieval era, we should therefore picture more than dramatic silhouettes against castle walls. We should imagine workshops glowing with forge light, carpenters calculating angles by eye, archers strengthening their draw through daily practice, engineers adjusting counterweights until range improved by a few vital meters. In that quiet persistence, measured in generations rather than headlines, we find the true character of medieval innovation. As we bring this long exploration to its final moments, it is worth considering how the creative weapons of the medieval era continue to shape modern imagination. Films, novels, and games often emphasize spectacle, the flash of steel, the towering siege engine, the thunder of cavalry. Yet behind those dramatic images lies a quieter truth. Medieval weaponry was rarely about grandeur. It was about reliability. What made a weapon successful in the Middle Ages was not how impressive it appeared, but how consistently it performed under pressure. A spear that did not splinter on impact. A crossbow mechanism that did not misfire in damp weather. A suit of armor that distributed weight without exhausting its wearer. These practical concerns guided innovation far more than aesthetic ambition. There is also something deeply human in the way medieval societies balanced tradition with adaptation. Weapons were often tied to lineage and honor. A sword might be passed down through generations, carrying memory as well as utility. Yet even revered forms were modified when circumstances demanded it. Sentiment did not prevent refinement. This ability to respect tradition while still adjusting to reality is one of the most understated aspects of medieval creativity. The gradual shift from feudal levies to more professionalized forces further influenced design. As standing armies became more common in the later medieval period, standardization increased. Uniform pikes, coordinated artillery units, and organized supply chains required systematic thinking. Creative weapons were no longer isolated craftsman projects. They became part of broader strategic planning. The scale of coordination expanded. It is important to recognize that medieval innovation was rarely centralized in a single location. Instead, it emerged in parallel across regions facing similar pressures. The need to counter cavalry encouraged long infantry weapons in multiple areas. The need to breach fortifications inspired siege engines wherever walls dominated politics. Gunpowder experimentation occurred in various parts of Eurasia before spreading widely. Creativity was distributed, not confined. Even failure contributed to progress. When a siege engine collapsed prematurely, builders learned about structural limits. When armor proved too heavy for extended campaigning, weight was reduced and articulation improved. When early firearms malfunctioned, powder mixtures and barrel casting techniques were refined. Each setback informed the next attempt. Trial and error were fundamental to medieval technological growth. By the end of the 15th century, the medieval world stood at a threshold. The integration of artillery, the refinement of infantry formations, and the administrative capacity to equip larger forces marked the transition toward early modern warfare. Yet this transformation did not emerge suddenly. It was the cumulative result of centuries of disciplined adaptation. The creative weapons of the medieval era therefore represent more than isolated innovations. They embody a long-term pattern of problem-solving. Communities observed threats, adjusted materials, reorganized formations, and shared knowledge. Over time, these incremental changes reshaped entire political landscapes. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of this history. Innovation does not always arrive in dramatic leaps. Often it advances step by step, guided by necessity. The medieval blacksmith refining steel temperature, the engineer recalculating a trebuchet's sling length, the commander reorganizing infantry ranks, each contributed to a broader transformation without fully seeing its end point. When we look back now, we can trace the arc. We can see how polearms countered cavalry, how missile weapons reshaped open fields, how siege engines contested stone walls, how gunpowder altered fortifications. But for those living through it, each adjustment was immediate and practical. The Middle Ages, viewed through their weapons, reveal a civilization deeply attentive to survival. Creativity was not optional. It was woven into daily labor and long-term planning. Iron and timber became instruments not only of war, but of adaptation. And so, when we think about the creative weapons of the medieval era, we should remember that they were shaped by hands that understood constraint, by minds that valued experience, and by societies determined to endure. In that steady determination, quiet, methodical, and persistent, we find the enduring legacy of medieval ingenuity. If we allow ourselves one last perspective, it is this: medieval weapons were part of a broader culture of systems thinking, even if the people of the time would never have used that phrase. No weapon functioned alone. A pike required disciplined ranks. A crossbow required pavises or cover during reloading. A siege engine required engineers, carpenters, rope makers, and coordinated crews. An early cannon required powder supply, shot casting, and careful positioning. Each tool operated within a network. This system's awareness shaped decision-making. Commanders did not simply choose weapons. They chose combinations. Missile troops softened a position before infantry advanced. Cavalry exploited openings created by foot soldiers. Artillery weakened defenses before siege towers rolled forward. Medieval creativity therefore lay not only in the object, but in integration. The effectiveness of a weapon often depended on how intelligently it was paired with others. Communication also evolved alongside armament. Drums, horns, and banners coordinated formations across noisy battlefields. Signals determined when to advance, hold, or withdraw. These communication tools, though not weapons in the narrow sense, were essential to making weapons effective. Creativity extended into organization and timing. The increasing complexity of warfare required clearer chains of command. As armies grew larger and more professional, logistical planning became critical. Supplying arrows, bolts, spare bowstrings, replacement shafts, powder, and shot required foresight. Medieval campaigns that failed often did so not because of inferior weapons, but because of strained supply lines. The lesson was clear. Innovation in weapon design must be matched by innovation in support systems. There is also an emotional dimension worth acknowledging. For the individuals who carried these weapons, they represented responsibility. A spear or bow was not merely equipment. It symbolized participation in collective defense. Medieval communities expected able-bodied individuals to contribute when called upon. Weapon familiarity was tied to civic duty. Creativity in design therefore intersected with identity and obligation. As gunpowder technology matured, its demands accelerated administrative development. Powder had to be stored carefully, protected from moisture, and transported securely. Artillery required trained specialists. These requirements gradually shifted power toward centralized authorities capable of sustaining such infrastructure. The creative weapon became a catalyst for political change. Yet through all these transitions, certain medieval principles endured. Balance between mobility and protection, concentration of force at critical points, and adaptation to terrain. These principles remain recognizable in modern military doctrine. The tools have changed dramatically, but the underlying logic of problem-solving persists. In studying creative weapons of the medieval era, we ultimately encounter a society deeply engaged with material constraints and strategic realities. The Middle Ages were not technologically dormant centuries. They were marked by steady, practical innovation shaped by necessity. Iron was refined more carefully. Wood was selected more strategically. Formations were drilled more rigorously. Counterweights were adjusted for greater efficiency. Powder mixtures were tested for reliability. Each refinement reflected a willingness to learn from experience. When we strip away romantic imagery and dramatic retellings, what remains is a portrait of disciplined creativity. Medieval societies confronted evolving challenges with patience. They did not always achieve perfection, but they improved incrementally. Over generations, those improvements accumulated into profound transformation. So as we conclude this journey through the creative weapons of the medieval era, we are left not with spectacle, but with respect for the craftsmen, soldiers, engineers, and leaders who navigated a world of uncertainty using the tools they could shape and the knowledge they could share. Their legacy is not simply preserved in steel fragments or stone ruins. It survives in the enduring human habit of adaptation, the quiet determination to observe, refine, and endure. As we settle into a final reflection, it is worth recognizing that medieval creativity in weapons was rarely driven by abstract curiosity. It was driven by vulnerability. Communities faced raids, rival claims to land, shifting loyalties, and external invasions. In that environment, preparation was a form of stability. A well-armed town, a disciplined militia, or a fortified castle signaled not aggression alone, but deterrence. Creative weapons, therefore, contributed to peace as much as to conflict. The knowledge that a city possessed strong crossbowmen or effective artillery could discourage attack altogether. This deterrent function shaped investment decisions. Wealthy merchant cities funded arsenals not merely to wage war, but to protect trade routes. Rural lords fortified estates to secure harvests. Monarchs standardized equipment to maintain authority across fragmented territories. The weapon, in many cases, was an insurance policy against instability. Creativity ensured that this insurance remained credible. Another aspect that deserves attention is repair culture. Medieval societies were accustomed to maintaining rather than discarding. Armor was re-riveted. Blades were resharpened and sometimes reforged. Wooden shafts were replaced. Leather straps were patched. This ongoing cycle of maintenance fostered intimate familiarity with weaknesses and stress points. In repairing, craftsmen discovered opportunities to improve. Innovation was often born at the workbench of restoration. Weather and climate also influenced design decisions. Damp conditions could weaken bowstrings and corrode metal. Cold could make certain materials brittle. Siege engines exposed to prolonged outdoor use required durable construction. Medieval innovation responded to these environmental pressures with protective coverings, oil treatments, reinforced joints, and practical adjustments that enhanced longevity. Survival depended on anticipating natural forces as much as human ones. Even transportation logistics shaped weapon development. Armies marched on foot or horseback, sometimes over difficult terrain. Weapons needed to be portable and durable. Siege engines that were too cumbersome might be dismantled and rebuilt on site. Artillery pieces were mounted on wheeled carriages to improve mobility. Creativity in this context meant balancing power with practicality. We should also acknowledge the human cost embedded within this innovation. Every refinement in weapon design reflected a recognition of danger. Armor thickened because previous armor had failed. Impact weapons concentrated force because cutting edges were no longer sufficient. Gunpowder expanded because mechanical methods had limits. Each adaptation tells us that medieval societies were attentive to the realities of injury and loss. They learned from painful experience. And yet, despite centuries of refinement, there was no final solution, no perfect weapon that ended vulnerability. Instead, there was a continuous cycle of challenge and response. That cycle is perhaps the defining feature of medieval military creativity. It was not about achieving invincibility. It was about narrowing risk. As the medieval era gradually transitioned into the early modern period, the accumulated knowledge of metallurgy, engineering, and organization enabled rapid scaling of newer technologies. But those advances were rooted in habits formed long before. Without centuries of careful forging, balancing, drilling, and experimenting, the integration of more complex systems would have faltered. The creative weapons of the medieval era therefore stand as markers of a society that understood adaptation as necessity. They reveal communities that were observant, disciplined, and persistent. They remind us that innovation does not require laboratories or formal scientific frameworks to exist. It requires attention, collaboration, and willingness to adjust. When we look at a halberd's carefully shaped head, a crossbow's winding mechanism, a trebuchet's counterweight, or the reinforced barrel of an early cannon, we are seeing answers crafted under pressure. These objects are not merely relics of violence. They are records of learning. And perhaps that is the final takeaway. Medieval weapon creativity was not dramatic revolution, but steady refinement, shaped by constraint, tested by necessity, and carried forward by generations determined to protect what they valued. In that steady human determination, the Middle Ages reveal themselves not as a static age, but as a dynamic one, an era defined by practical intelligence and the enduring instinct to adapt. As we reach the quiet end of this journey, one final perspective helps bring everything into focus. Medieval weapons were expressions of time. They reflected the knowledge available, the materials accessible, and the threats perceived in a particular century. When those conditions shifted, the weapons shifted with them. Nothing remained untouched by context. In the early medieval period, when political authority was fragmented and warfare often local, weapons tended to be relatively simple and personal. Spears, axes, and swords suited smaller engagements and mobile conflict. As territorial states expanded and fortified centers became more common, the scale of armament expanded as well. Siege machinery grew more sophisticated. Armor evolved to match increasingly organized forms of combat. By the later medieval centuries, the introduction of gunpowder marked not a sudden break, but the continuation of a pattern already well established. Identify weakness, apply pressure, refine response. This gradual evolution challenges the misconception that medieval societies were resistant to change. On the contrary, they were pragmatic. A design survived only as long as it served its purpose. When plate armor made wide slashing less effective, thrusting techniques gained prominence. When walls resisted ladders, towers were built. When towers proved vulnerable, artillery answered. The dialogue between defense and offense was continuous. It is also important to remember that medieval creativity unfolded without modern measurement tools or scientific language. Builders relied on proportion, experience, and observation. A trebuchet's range was adjusted by feel as much as calculation. A sword's balance was judged in the hand. Metallurgy advanced through controlled repetition rather than chemical formulae. This does not imply guesswork. It reflects a different mode of knowledge, empirical, embodied, and communal. Over centuries, this form of practical intelligence created remarkably resilient systems. Fortified cities could withstand prolonged sieges. Infantry formations could repel cavalry once thought unstoppable. Maritime powers developed fleets capable of projecting influence across seas. These outcomes were not accidents. They were the result of iterative design. And yet, despite all the ingenuity, medieval warfare remained uncertain. Whether disease, morale, and supply could overturn even the most carefully prepared plans. Creative weapons reduced vulnerability. They did not eliminate it. That awareness fostered humility in design. Redundancy and backup solutions were common. Armies carried multiple weapon types. Castles incorporated layered defenses. Diversity itself was a strategy. When we step back, the creative weapons of the medieval era tell a broader story about adaptation under constraint. They reveal a civilization deeply aware of its limits, yet unwilling to remain static. Iron was scarce but forged skillfully. Timber was abundant but shaped strategically. Powder was volatile but harnessed carefully. The Middle Ages were not an age of reckless experimentation. They were an age of steady refinement. Each improvement was built upon observation, passed through apprenticeship, and tested in real conditions. Generations inherited not only tools, but the habit of improving them. And so, As we close this exploration of creative weapons of the medieval era, what remains is not a catalogue of strange devices, but a portrait of disciplined innovation. It is the image of workshops lit by forge fires, of engineers studying angles of walls, of archers strengthening their draw through daily repetition, of commanders learning from hard lessons and adjusting accordingly. The medieval world may feel distant, but its pattern of adaptation is familiar. Faced with uncertainty, it responded with craft. Faced with challenge, it responded with refinement. The weapons that survive in museums are not merely instruments of conflict, they are artifacts of persistence. And in that persistence, forged across centuries, we find the true character of medieval creativity: practical, patient, and profoundly human. As a final meditation on the creative weapons of the medieval era, it is helpful to recognize that what we have been tracing is not merely a catalogue of arms, but a philosophy of response. Medieval societies did not separate survival from innovation. The two were inseparable. Every improvement in metalwork, every adjustment in formation, every recalibrated counterweight represented an understanding that stability required effort. What makes medieval weapon development particularly compelling is its balance between continuity and transformation. Certain forms, like the spear, endured for centuries because they worked. Others, like the heavily armored knight dominating open battle, rose to prominence and then gradually declined as conditions changed. Creativity did not discard the past carelessly, but neither did it cling to it when reality shifted. There was a quiet pragmatism at work. This pragmatism extended into the rhythms of everyday life. Blacksmiths who forged plowshares also forged spearheads. Carpenters who built barns constructed siege frames. Rope makers supplied both ships and artillery engines. The boundary between civilian and military production was often thin. In times of peace, skills were maintained through ordinary labor. In times of war, those same skills were redirected. The creative weapon was rarely born in isolation. It emerged from a living economy. Even the language of medieval warfare reflects careful thought. Chronicles frequently describe preparation, positioning, and timing. Victories were attributed not only to bravery, but to planning. Defeats were analyzed for lessons. Over generations, this accumulation of recorded experience reinforced adaptive habits. Written and oral traditions carried forward insights that shaped future decisions. It is also worth noting that medieval weapon creativity often involved restraint. Not every powerful idea was immediately embraced. Gunpowder, for instance, was known in Europe for centuries before it fully reshaped warfare. Its integration required infrastructure, training, and confidence in reliability. Medieval societies tested cautiously. Innovation was measured against cost and risk. This caution underscores an important truth. Creativity is not synonymous with rapid change. It can also mean deliberate pacing. Medieval communities weighed their options. They balanced tradition against new opportunity. They understood that adopting a weapon required more than forging it. It required training, logistics, and strategic adaptation. As artillery grew stronger and fortifications adapted in response, we see the medieval mindset reaching toward early modernity. Star-shaped bastions, angled walls, and integrated gun platforms reflect accumulated knowledge about impact and deflection. These designs did not appear spontaneously. They were the product of centuries spent studying force, structure, and failure. And yet, Despite technological shifts, one constant remained: human skill. No weapon functioned independently of its user. Archers required strength and discipline. Pikemen required coordination. Engineers required judgment. Even the most advanced cannon depended on trained gunners who understood powder measurement and recoil. The medieval era valued embodied expertise. In the end, the creative weapons of the medieval period tell a story about adaptation rooted in community. Workshops, guilds, armies, and councils all participated in the slow shaping of solutions. Innovation was shared knowledge refined over time. It was less about singular inventors and more about collective improvement. When we look at the remnants of that world, weathered blades, fragments of armor, stone fortifications, we are seeing the outcome of persistent problem-solving. The Middle Ages were not defined by stagnation, but by responsiveness. They faced evolving challenges and responded with materials at hand, guided by observation and memory. So as we close this exploration, what lingers is not the noise of battle, but the quieter image of refinement. Iron glowing in a forge as a craftsman adjusts its shape. Engineers measuring timber lengths for balance. Soldiers drilling in formation until movement becomes instinct. Generations learning, adjusting, and passing knowledge forward. The creative weapons of the medieval era were not extraordinary because they were exotic. They were extraordinary because they worked, because they represented thoughtful answers to real pressures. In their steady evolution, we see a civilization committed to endurance. And in that endurance, patient, disciplined, and deeply human, we find the lasting legacy of medieval innovation. As we reach the true end of this long study, it becomes clear that the creative weapons of the medieval era ultimately reveal something larger than warfare. They reveal a mindset shaped by limits. Medieval societies did not possess industrial manufacturing, precision engineering tools, or advanced chemistry in the modern sense. What they possessed instead was attentiveness, an ability to observe patterns, test adjustments, and remember outcomes. Every weapon we've discussed existed within a web of constraints. Metal quality varied, timber warped, weather disrupted plans, supply lines faltered. Yet rather than paralyzing innovation, these constraints refined it. A polearm head was shaped to maximize impact while conserving metal. A crossbow spanning device multiplied human strength without requiring lifelong training. A trebuchet translated gravity into force using materials that could be sourced and assembled with available skills. Even early cannons, crude by later standards, reflected careful experimentation with reinforcement and powder ratios. This pattern of adaptation tells us that medieval creativity was deeply empirical. It was grounded in experience. Knowledge spread through apprenticeship, military service, trade, and diplomacy. A design that succeeded in one region might travel across borders, adjusted to suit new terrain or political structures. There was no single center of innovation. Instead, there was a network of shared learning shaped by necessity. Importantly, medieval weapons also reflect a balance between offense and preservation. Armor sought to reduce harm. Fortifications sought to deter conflict. Even the most imposing siege engine often served as a psychological instrument, encouraging surrender before walls were fully breached. The creative act was not solely about destruction. It was about control, influence, and protection. As the centuries progressed, we see how incremental adjustments accumulated into transformative capability. Infantry formations disciplined around long pikes reshaped the dominance of cavalry. Artillery redefined architecture. Administrative systems capable of supplying powder and shot strengthened central authority. Yet these changes were not sudden revolutions. They were built on habits formed over generations, habits of refinement, evaluation, and cautious integration. The medieval era's weapon innovation also challenges modern assumptions about progress. Advancement did not move in a straight line toward greater complexity. Sometimes simplification was the innovation. A standardized spear easier to produce in quantity could prove more effective than an ornate blade crafted for a single warrior. Efficiency often mattered more than embellishment. When we strip away romantic imagery, what remains is an image of workshops and drill fields, of communities engaged in practical thinking. A blacksmith gauging heat by color, an engineer adjusting sling length to extend range, a commander reorganizing troops based on the lessons of a muddy field. Each small decision contributed to larger patterns. There is a quiet dignity in this process. Medieval weapon makers and users were not chasing abstract ideals. They were responding to immediate realities. Protect the harvest, defend the city, secure the trade route, survive the campaign season. Creativity was tied to survival, and survival demanded discipline. And perhaps that is the final insight. The creative weapons of the medieval era were not isolated marvels, nor were they crude relics of a so-called Dark Age. They were thoughtful, functional responses to a world in flux. They show us a civilization that understood adaptation as a continuous responsibility. When we look back across those centuries, we see iron shaped by steady hands, timber cut with purpose, powder mixed with caution, and formations drilled with patience. We see communities willing to learn from failure and refine their tools accordingly. In that patient refinement, measured not in headlines, but in generations, we find the true character of medieval innovation. It was practical, it was cumulative, and above all, it was human. And if we allow ourselves one last layer of reflection, we begin to see that medieval weapons were not simply answers to threats. They were expressions of worldview. The Middle Ages were shaped by uncertainty. Shifting borders, dynastic disputes, famine, plague, religious tension, and external invasion. In such a landscape, preparedness was woven into daily existence. Creative weaponry was one visible manifestation of a deeper cultural instinct. Anticipate danger, respond methodically, endure. There is something striking about how rarely medieval innovation was reckless. Even when new technologies emerged, like gunpowder, they were integrated gradually. Early hand cannons did not immediately replace bows. Artillery did not instantly make castles irrelevant. Instead, old and new coexisted. This coexistence reveals a cautious intelligence. Medieval societies tested innovations within familiar systems before fully committing to transformation. Stability mattered. We can also observe how weapon design mirrored social hierarchy while simultaneously reshaping it. A knight's equipment was expensive and specialized, reinforcing elite identity. Yet, as disciplined infantry formations proved their strength, power began to redistribute. The Swiss pike squares and English longbowmen demonstrated that coordinated common soldiers could influence outcomes dramatically. Creative weapons did not just solve tactical problems, they altered social dynamics. Beyond Europe, similar patterns unfolded. In the Islamic world, advancements in steel production influenced blade resilience and flexibility. In East Asia, variations of gunpowder weaponry appeared and spread. Across Eurasia, knowledge traveled through trade routes, conquest, and diplomacy. Medieval innovation was not isolated. It was interconnected. The creative impulse responded wherever communities encountered new challenges. The durability of certain designs also tells a powerful story. The spear persisted for millennia because it remained effective. The bow evolved in form but retained its core principle. Even when firearms gained prominence, pikes accompanied them in combined formations for generations. This layered continuity suggests that medieval thinkers valued reliability over novelty. A weapon earned its place through proven performance. Training, too, was a form of creativity. Drilling formations, coordinating volleys, synchronizing movements, these were disciplined arts. A weapon's effectiveness depended on collective timing. Medieval commanders understood that technology alone did not guarantee victory. Organization amplified tools. In many ways, the most creative weapon of the later medieval era was disciplined cohesion itself. There is also a philosophical dimension to consider. Medieval chronicles often frame warfare within moral and religious contexts. Victory and defeat were interpreted through spiritual as well as material lenses. Yet, even within those frameworks, practical adjustments were constant. Faith did not replace engineering. It coexisted with it. Siege towers were still measured carefully. Armor was still tested. Powder was still refined. As centuries passed, incremental refinements accumulated into broader transformations. The administrative capacity to produce and store arms strengthened emerging states. The understanding of force and structure laid groundwork for later engineering achievements. The experience of coordinating large armies influenced governance. Creative weapons were embedded in institutional growth. When we look at a halberd's balanced proportions, a crossbow's mechanical leverage, a trebuchet's calculated arc, or a cannon's reinforced barrel, we are witnessing applied reasoning shaped by lived necessity. These objects are quiet evidence of disciplined thought. They remind us that innovation does not always require written theories. It can emerge from attentive practice. The medieval world was not frozen in time. It adapted continuously, often subtly, sometimes dramatically. The creative weapons of the era stand as markers of that motion. They embody a civilization responding to its environment with patience and skill. And so, as we finally close this extended exploration, what remains is not the clangor of battle, but the steady rhythm of refinement. Generation after generation, craftsmen improved materials. Soldiers improved coordination. Leaders improved logistics. Each small adjustment carried forward. The creative weapons of the medieval era are therefore less about spectacle and more about endurance. They reflect a world that understood survival as an active process, one requiring vigilance, discipline, and adaptation. In iron shaped by fire, in timber balanced against gravity, in powder measured with care, we see the enduring human instinct to respond thoughtfully to challenge. And in that instinct, quiet, persistent, and cumulative, we find the true legacy of medieval creativity. As we take one final, steady look across the medieval landscape, it becomes clear that creative weapons were never isolated flashes of brilliance. They were part of a culture that understood time differently. Change did not need to be immediate to be meaningful. Improvement did not need to be dramatic to be decisive. Over the span of centuries, small refinements accumulated into structural transformation. The medieval craftsman worked in generations, not product cycles. A swordsmith inherited techniques from a master, adjusted them through experience, and passed them forward. An armorer refined articulation at the elbow or knee after observing how plates restricted movement. An engineer adjusted the sling length of a trebuchet after noting inconsistent range. Each modification might appear minor in isolation, but over decades, those minor corrections reshaped effectiveness. What stands out most is the relationship between observation and humility. Medieval warfare repeatedly exposed weaknesses. Armor failed under concentrated force. Walls cracked beneath sustained bombardment. Cavalry charges faltered in mud. Rather than ignoring these lessons, medieval societies absorbed them. Creative weapons were often the result of acknowledging vulnerability. This humility is especially visible in defensive architecture. Castles did not remain static monuments. They were reinforced, expanded, retrofitted. Towers were thickened. Gatehouses became more complex. Moats were deepened. Later, with the rise of artillery, walls were angled and lowered to better absorb impact. Each architectural shift reflected a recognition that no defense was permanent. Similarly, personal armor evolved from chainmail to plate not as a sudden leap, but through incremental layering. Additional plates protected vulnerable areas. Articulation improved to preserve mobility. Helm designs shifted to balance visibility and coverage. These changes demonstrate practical problem-solving grounded in battlefield experience. The rise of gunpowder offers another example of measured adaptation. Early firearms were unreliable and slow, yet their potential was evident. Medieval societies experimented cautiously. Powder mixtures were refined. Casting techniques improved to reduce barrel failure. Carriages were strengthened to absorb recoil. Artillery crews developed procedures for safe handling. Over time, reliability increased, not through sudden invention, but through disciplined repetition. It is also worth remembering that medieval weapon creativity often required collaboration across trades. A single siege engine depended on carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and laborers. A crossbow required skilled wood shaping, metal forging, and string crafting. Innovation was rarely solitary. It was communal, built upon networks of specialized knowledge. Even economic systems adapted to support military innovation. Mining operations expanded. Trade in metal and timber intensified. Administrative record-keeping improved to track inventories. These developments were not separate from weapon design. They sustained it. Creative weapons influenced the growth of early bureaucratic structures. And yet, despite increasing sophistication, the medieval mindset remained grounded in practicality. A weapon that was too complex to repair in the field was a liability. A design that required rare materials risked inconsistency. Reliability often outweighed elegance. This pragmatic filtering process ensured that successful weapons endured because they balanced effectiveness with sustainability. When we view the Middle Ages through this lens, the narrative of stagnation dissolves. Instead, we see steady motion, sometimes subtle, sometimes visible, but always present. Creative weapons are simply the most tangible evidence of a broader pattern. Societies learning from experience and adjusting accordingly. In many ways, the medieval era teaches a quiet lesson about innovation itself. Progress is not always loud. It often unfolds in workshops and training fields, far from dramatic moments. It lives in the discipline of repetition and the courage to refine. As we conclude this extended reflection on creative weapons of the medieval era, what remains is a sense of respect for that steady discipline. The halberd, the longbow, the crossbow, the trebuchet, the early cannon, each represents a thoughtful answer to a real problem. They are not merely relics of conflict. They are artifacts of adaptation. They remind us that even within limits, human communities find ways to adjust, improve, and endure. And in that enduring instinct to observe, refine, and pass knowledge forward, we find the lasting legacy of medieval creativity. As we bring this long exploration fully to rest, it is worth stepping back and seeing the medieval world not as a backdrop of castles and battlefields, but as a living laboratory of adaptation. The creative weapons of the medieval era were not anomalies scattered across time. They were steady responses to recurring uncertainty. They reflect a civilization that understood a simple truth: security is never permanent, and preparation must evolve. One of the most revealing aspects of medieval weapon innovation is how closely it tracked shifts in power. When political authority was fragmented, warfare was often local and mobile, favoring versatile personal weapons, spears, axes, and swords. As territorial states consolidated and fortified cities became centers of administration and wealth, the scale of conflict expanded. Siege warfare grew more sophisticated. Defensive architecture became more calculated. Artillery, once experimental, matured into a strategic instrument. Each phase of weapon development mirrors a broader structural change in society. And yet, despite these transformations, the medieval approach remained grounded in continuity. A spear used in the 12th century would still be recognizable in the 15th. A bow, though refined, operated on the same principle across generations. Even when firearms began to dominate, pikes and polearms did not vanish overnight. Instead, they were integrated into combined formations. This coexistence reveals a culture that valued tested reliability alongside experimentation. There is also a deeply human dimension to this story. Every creative weapon was shaped by hands that understood risk. A blacksmith forging a mace head knew that its balance might determine survival. A carpenter constructing a siege tower understood that structural weakness could collapse under pressure. A gunner measuring powder charges recognized the danger of miscalculation. Medieval innovation was never abstract. It was tied to lived consequence. Training amplified design. The English longbow was only as effective as the archer who had strengthened his body through years of practice. The Swiss pike square depended on discipline and cohesion. Early artillery required coordinated crews who understood timing and recoil. In this sense, creativity was not confined to materials. It lived in muscle memory, in drilled formations, in shared procedure. The weapon and the human form became extensions of each other. Economic and environmental realities also shaped innovation. Forests supplied timber for ships and siege engines, but overuse demanded careful management. Mines yielded iron, yet production fluctuated with labor and political stability. Powder required saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, tying military capacity to trade and chemistry. Medieval societies navigated these constraints with pragmatic calculation. A weapon that required rare resources risked inconsistency. Designs that balanced accessibility with power endured. As fortifications evolved in response to artillery, we see the medieval mind at work in architectural adaptation. Walls lowered and thickened. Angles replaced flat surfaces. Earth absorbed impact more effectively than stone alone. The emergence of bastioned systems near the end of the medieval period was not a rejection of earlier castles, but their refinement under new pressure. Innovation was cumulative, not disruptive. Culturally, weapons also shaped identity. Knights bore swords not only as tools, but as symbols of status and lineage. City militias carried standardized arms that represented communal responsibility. Even ceremonial guards retained halberds long after their battlefield peak, preserving memory of their utility. Weapon forms became visual language, recognizable markers of authority and tradition. Yet, for all their symbolism, medieval weapons were grounded in pragmatism. A design survived only if it solved a problem. Ornate decoration could enhance prestige, but it could not compensate for imbalance or fragility. This practical filter ensured that successful forms spread and persisted. When we examine the creative weapons of the medieval era, what ultimately emerges is a portrait of disciplined persistence. There was no single moment of dramatic breakthrough that defined the period. Instead, there was 1,000 years of steady refinement. Armor improved plate by plate. Siege engines gained efficiency adjustment by adjustment. Firearms gained reliability mixture by mixture. Each generation inherited lessons and contributed subtle changes. This cumulative innovation challenges the outdated idea of the Middle Ages as stagnant. On the contrary, it was an era of continuous negotiation with reality. Threats shifted, materials evolved, political structures transformed, and weapon design kept pace. And so, as we finally close this extended reflection, the image that remains is not one of chaos, but of careful motion. Workshops illuminated by forged light, engineers measuring timber beams against the sky, archers testing tension, artillery crews calibrating range, communities learning from loss and improving quietly. The creative weapons of the medieval era stand as enduring evidence of that steady effort. They remind us that innovation does not require modern terminology or industrial scale. It requires observation, collaboration, and the patience to refine. In iron shaped by heat, in wood balanced by gravity, in powder measured by cautious hands, we see the medieval world responding thoughtfully to uncertainty. And in that response, persistent, adaptive, and profoundly human, we find the true legacy of medieval creativity. As we allow this exploration to settle into its final moments, it is helpful to see medieval weapons not only as tools of conflict, but as reflections of how societies understood time, risk, and responsibility. The Middle Ages stretched across roughly a millennium, long enough for countless cycles of challenge and response. Creative weapons were never static achievements. They were chapters in an ongoing dialogue between human intention and material limitation. One of the defining characteristics of medieval innovation was its patience. Progress unfolded slowly because it had to, Metallurgical improvements depended on access to better and more consistent furnace temperatures. Armor articulation improved through years of trial, observing where plates pinched or cracked. Siege engines grew more efficient as builders learned which timber held stress and how sling length influenced trajectory. None of this was rushed. Knowledge accumulated through repetition and correction. That gradual pace did not imply hesitation. It reflected realism. Medieval societies understood that adopting a new weapon meant reorganizing around it. Introducing artillery required transport systems, powder storage, trained crews, and reinforced structures. Fielding large pike formations demanded disciplined drilling and collective trust. Creativity was never confined to the forge. It extended into administration and organization. We also see how innovation often followed failure. When cavalry charges faltered against tight infantry ranks, new tactics emerged. When castle walls crumbled under sustained bombardment, architects redesigned defenses. When early hand cannons misfired or burst, casting methods improved. Medieval warfare was an unforgiving testing ground. Lessons learned were rarely theoretical. They were drawn from lived consequence. The integration of gunpowder toward the end of the medieval period provides a clear example of layered adaptation. Firearms did not instantly displace bows or crossbows. Instead, mixed formations combined strengths. Pikes protected gunners during reload. Artillery supported infantry advances. Older technologies remained valuable within new frameworks. This willingness to integrate rather than discard highlights a pragmatic mindset. Geography also shaped creativity in profound ways. In mountainous regions, mobility often outweighed heavy armor. On open plains, cavalry retained advantages until countered by disciplined infantry. Coastal powers invested heavily in naval armament, adapting weapons to the confined spaces of decks and rigging. Medieval weapon design was never universal. It was responsive to terrain and climate. Another enduring theme is the balance between protection and burden. Armor protected but weighed heavily. Longer weapons extended reach but required coordination. Siege engines delivered power but demanded resources and time. Every creative solution introduced trade-offs. Medieval innovation was therefore a process of careful calibration, maximizing benefit while managing cost. It is also important to remember that medieval societies were deeply interconnected. Trade routes carried not only goods but ideas. Encounters between cultures, whether through commerce, diplomacy, or conflict, exposed craftsmen and commanders to unfamiliar designs. Over time, techniques blended. Steel production methods, blade shapes, and siege concepts crossed borders. Creativity thrived on exchange. Beyond physical tools, there was innovation in doctrine. Manuals on fencing and military organization began to circulate more widely in the later Middle Ages. These texts reveal analytical thinking about leverage, timing, and positioning. Even without modern scientific vocabulary, medieval thinkers were engaging systematically with mechanics and human movement. The creative weapons of the medieval era therefore represent more than engineering. They reflect communities learning collectively. A blacksmith refined tempering through observation. An engineer adjusted a counterweight after repeated tests. A commander reorganized troops after a costly defeat. Knowledge was experiential and cumulative. And yet, for all their ingenuity, medieval societies never achieved final security. The cycle of adaptation continued because new pressures always emerged. Political alliances shifted. Trade patterns changed. Technologies advanced incrementally. Stability required vigilance. When we look back now, the halberd, the longbow, the crossbow, the trebuchet, and the early cannon appear as milestones along a long road. They were not endpoints, but moments of balance, solutions effective for a time before circumstances shifted again. Perhaps that is the most enduring insight. Medieval creativity was not driven by the pursuit of perfection, but by the pursuit of sufficiency. A weapon did not need to be flawless. It needed to work reliably enough to meet the present challenge. In that steady effort, measured across centuries rather than headlines, we see the true character of the Middle Ages. Not stagnant, not reckless, but deliberate. Communities shaping materials with care. Leaders adjusting tactics with humility. Craftsmen passing skills forward with patience. The creative weapons of the medieval era stand as quiet testimony to that disciplined persistence. Forged in uncertainty, refined through experience, and carried forward by generations who understood that adaptation was the only constant. And in that understanding, practical, patient, and profoundly human, we find the lasting legacy of medieval innovation. As we arrive at the true closing edge of this discussion, it becomes clear that the creative weapons of the medieval era cannot be understood simply as instruments of destruction. They were, more accurately, instruments of negotiation between vulnerability and protection, between tradition and change, between local realities and broader geopolitical shifts. Each refinement in design represented a conversation between past experience and present necessity. What distinguished medieval innovation was not speed, but steadiness. In a world without rapid industrial production or centralized scientific institutions, improvement depended on memory and repetition. A forge master remembered which alloy bent without breaking. An armorer recalled where stress lines appeared after prolonged use. A commander remembered how a formation collapsed under unexpected pressure. These memories became adjustments, and those adjustments became tradition. The endurance of certain weapons across centuries is telling. The spear persisted because it balanced simplicity, cost, and effectiveness. The bow endured because it extended force beyond immediate reach. Even as firearms slowly rose to prominence, these older tools retained situational value. Medieval societies did not abandon what worked. They layered new solutions onto established foundations. That layering is one of the most consistent patterns of the era. Siege warfare, in particular, demonstrates this continuity. Early medieval sieges relied heavily on ladders, rams, and basic traction engines. Over time, counterweight trebuchets increased range and consistency. Defenders responded with thicker walls and improved gatehouses. Eventually, gunpowder artillery forced further architectural adaptation. At no point was there a clean break. Instead, there was escalation and recalibration, each step measured against experience. Personal combat evolved in similar fashion. As plate armor spread among elites, swords became narrower and more thrust-oriented. Manuals emphasized grappling and half-sword techniques. Impact weapons gained prominence. None of these changes occurred in isolation. They were responses to observed weaknesses. The battlefield functioned as a proving ground for refinement. Beyond Europe, comparable patterns emerged. In regions where mounted archery dominated, composite bows were optimized for power and portability. In maritime cultures, boarding weapons were shaped by confined spaces. Across Eurasia, military tools reflected environmental demands. Medieval creativity was not uniform, but it was universal. Wherever communities faced sustained threat, adaptation followed. It is also important to consider the psychological dimension. The mere presence of certain weapons could alter behavior. A fortified town equipped with reliable crossbows and artillery might deter siege entirely. A disciplined pike formation could discourage cavalry charges before they began. In this sense, creative weapons shaped strategy as much as tactics. They influenced decisions before combat ever commenced. Administrative growth in the later medieval centuries further amplified innovation. As monarchies and city-states developed permanent arsenals and more systematic taxation, they gained the capacity to produce weapons at greater scale. Standardization became increasingly important. Interchangeable parts and consistent specifications reduced unpredictability. This bureaucratic underpinning was itself a form of creativity, organizational rather than mechanical. Yet even as systems grew more complex, the medieval approach remained grounded in tangible knowledge. Tools were tested by hand. Range was estimated by observation. Balance was judged by feel. The absence of modern instruments did not prevent careful calibration. It simply meant calibration occurred through practice rather than formula. Perhaps the most revealing feature of medieval weapon innovation is its humility. There was rarely an assumption of invincibility. Every improvement carried recognition of limits. Armor protected, but did not guarantee safety. Fortifications deterred, but did not ensure permanence. Artillery dominated for a time, until countermeasures emerged. This awareness fostered ongoing vigilance. When we look back at the creative weapons of the medieval era, what we see is not a collection of curiosities, but a living process. Iron was shaped by necessity. Timber was measured against gravity. Powder was mixed with caution. Formations were drilled until movement became instinct. Communities learned, adapted, and passed forward knowledge. The Middle Ages were not static centuries awaiting modern enlightenment. They were defined by gradual, disciplined problem-solving. Creative weapons were visible expressions of that mindset, practical answers forged under constraint. And so, as we close this extended journey, the image that remains is one of continuity. Generation after generation refining tools not for spectacle, but for survival. Innovation measured not in sudden breakthroughs, but in quiet reliability. In that persistence, patient, observant, and deeply human, we find the enduring legacy of medieval creativity. As we move into the final stretch of this reflection, it becomes clear that the creative weapons of the medieval era ultimately tell a story about adaptation across uncertainty. The Middle Ages were not defined by a single dominant technology or a uniform style of warfare. Instead, they were marked by constant variation, regional conflicts, shifting borders, evolving alliances, and changing economic realities. In such an environment, flexibility was more valuable than permanence. What is striking about medieval weapon innovation is how rarely it sought absolute solutions. There was no expectation that a new blade shape, a thicker wall, or a more powerful engine would permanently settle the balance between offense and defense. Instead, innovation functioned as adjustment. Each new development narrowed vulnerability, bought time, or shifted advantage, but never eliminated risk entirely. This realistic understanding of limitation fostered steady improvement rather than reckless experimentation. The relationship between material science and lived experience is especially revealing. Medieval metallurgists did not possess modern chemistry, yet they developed nuanced control over carbon content in steel through repetition and observation. Armorers learned which joints required additional articulation to preserve mobility. Bowyers understood how wood grain affected tension and resilience. This was empirical knowledge, earned through labor and passed forward through apprenticeship. It created a culture where refinement was continuous. We can also observe how military creativity shaped social structure. As infantry formations gained effectiveness through long pikes and disciplined coordination, the battlefield dominance of heavily armored cavalry began to shift. This transition did not occur overnight, nor did it erase elite influence, but it introduced new dynamics. Organized common soldiers could alter outcomes. Weapon innovation, therefore, intersected with broader social transformation. The same can be said of gunpowder. Its gradual integration required not only technical experimentation but administrative expansion. Powder had to be produced, stored, and transported. Cannons required specialized casting facilities. Gunners needed training. States capable of sustaining these systems strengthened their authority. Creative weapons, in this context, became catalysts for centralized governance. Environmental awareness also shaped design choices. A weapon suitable for dry climates might behave differently in damp conditions. Timber for siege engines had to withstand weather exposure. Powder storage required protection from moisture. Medieval societies developed protective coverings, reinforcement techniques, and storage systems to mitigate environmental risk. Adaptation extended beyond the battlefield to logistics and preservation. Another essential feature of medieval innovation is its cumulative character. Rarely did one invention redefine warfare instantly. Instead, multiple small changes interacted. Improved metallurgy strengthened armor. Better armor encouraged more precise thrusting weapons. Enhanced fortifications prompted stronger artillery. Each development influenced the next in a chain of incremental transformation. It is also important to appreciate the moral and psychological dimensions of medieval armament. Weapons were not solely mechanical objects. They were embedded in codes of honor, civic responsibility, and spiritual interpretation. A sword could symbolize lineage. A city arsenal represented communal defense. Even early firearms, disruptive as they were, had to be reconciled with existing frameworks of warfare ethics and tradition. Creativity unfolded within these cultural boundaries. By the late 15th century, Europe and surrounding regions stood at the threshold of profound military transformation. Yet that threshold was built upon centuries of disciplined adaptation. The creative weapons of the medieval era laid groundwork for the early modern world, not through dramatic rupture, but through steady refinement. When we examine these tools today, what stands out is not spectacle but intelligence. The halberd's balanced design, the crossbow's mechanical leverage, the trebuchet's gravitational calculation, the cannon's reinforced barrel, all reflect careful reasoning shaped by necessity. The Middle Ages, viewed through this lens, appear not stagnant but engaged. Communities faced threats with realism. They refined what worked, They discarded what failed. They integrated new ideas cautiously and pragmatically. And perhaps that is the enduring lesson. Medieval creativity was not driven by novelty. It was driven by responsibility to defend, to preserve, to endure. Innovation was measured against survival. As we conclude this long journey, what remains is a sense of respect for that quiet persistence. Across 1,000 years, people shaped iron, timber, rope, and powder into tools that answered the needs of their time. In that steady shaping, deliberate, cumulative, and profoundly human, we find the true legacy of creative weapons in the medieval era. As we settle into the final reflection of this extended exploration, it becomes evident that the creative weapons of the medieval era ultimately reveal more about human adaptability than about warfare alone. Across 1,000 years, societies repeatedly confronted instability, political fragmentation, territorial disputes, shifting trade networks, demographic crises, and technological surprises. Yet, rather than stagnating, they responded with measured innovation. Each weapon was not merely forged in iron, but in response to lived uncertainty. What stands out most clearly is the medieval commitment to iterative refinement. There were no sudden leaps from ignorance to mastery. Improvements emerged from careful observation. A blade bent under stress and was reforged differently. A wall cracked under bombardment and was reinforced with earth. A formation broke under cavalry pressure and was reorganized around longer pikes. The cycle was continuous. Test, learn, adjust. This process reflects a deep understanding of limits. Medieval craftsmen and commanders did not assume perfection. Armor protected but restricted movement. Artillery delivered force but demanded logistics. Crossbows offered mechanical advantage but required reloading time. Every tool involved compromise. Creativity, therefore, meant balancing trade-offs rather than eliminating them. It is also important to recognize that medieval weapon innovation was rarely individualistic. It depended on networks of skill. A single siege engine required carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, and laborers. A cannon depended on miners extracting or smelters refining metal, founders casting barrels, and gunners trained in powder measurement. Innovation was communal, sustained by shared expertise. The rise of administrative capacity during the later medieval period further amplified this creativity. Permanent arsenals, standardized equipment, and systematic record-keeping allowed states and cities to scale production. Organization itself became a form of technological advancement. Creative weapons were supported by creative governance. Cultural continuity also shaped development. Even as firearms gradually altered the balance of power, older weapons persisted in integrated formations. Pikes protected arquebusiers. Swords remained sidearms. Fortifications evolved rather than vanished. Medieval societies did not abandon familiar tools lightly. They layered new technologies atop established practices, creating hybrid systems that bridged eras. Geography reinforced diversity. In coastal regions, naval weapons adapted to the constraints of ship decks and rigging. In mountainous terrain, lighter equipment improved mobility. On open plains, cavalry and long-range missile troops shaped tactics. There was no single medieval battlefield. Creativity followed environment. Perhaps the most revealing insight lies in the relationship between weapon and psychology. The presence of disciplined formations or powerful artillery could deter conflict before it began. A well-defended city projected stability. In this sense, creative weapons were instruments of influence as much as violence. They shaped negotiation and diplomacy. The cumulative nature of medieval innovation also laid foundations for future transformation. By the time gunpowder reached maturity, centuries of metallurgical knowledge and logistical organization were already in place. Early modern military revolutions did not emerge from emptiness. They grew from medieval habit, steady refinement guided by necessity. When we step back and observe the creative weapons of the medieval era as a whole, a consistent pattern emerges. Societies learned from failure. They adapted cautiously. They integrated new tools without discarding what still worked. Innovation unfolded across generations rather than moments. This challenges the old image of the Middle Ages as technologically dormant. Instead, we see a civilization deeply engaged with material problem-solving. Iron was shaped carefully. Timber was measured precisely. Powder was mixed cautiously. Formations were drilled until cohesion became instinct. And so, as we finally close this extended examination, what remains is not spectacle but discipline. The halberd, the longbow, the crossbow, the trebuchet, the cannon, each stands as evidence of thoughtful adaptation. They are artifacts of persistence. The medieval era teaches us that innovation does not require modern laboratories or rapid industry. It requires attentiveness, collaboration, and the willingness to refine. In that quiet generational refinement, steady, pragmatic, and profoundly human, we find the enduring legacy of creative weapons in the medieval world. As we come to the true final stretch of this long reflection, it helps to see the creative weapons of the medieval era not simply as responses to danger, but as expressions of continuity in a world that often felt unstable. The Middle Ages were marked by shifting kingdoms, contested borders, epidemics, religious conflict, and economic change. Yet through all of this, certain habits endured. Chief among them, the habit of careful adjustment. Weapons evolved because life demanded it. What becomes especially clear is that medieval innovation was rarely about chasing superiority for its own sake. It was about maintaining balance. When armor became stronger, weapons adapted not to dominate permanently, but to restore equilibrium. When fortifications grew thicker, siege technologies developed not to eliminate defense entirely, but to challenge it. The medieval world functioned as a constant negotiation between opposing forces. Creativity existed within that negotiation. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval weapon development is its intergenerational continuity. A swordsmith did not invent in isolation. He inherited techniques from masters before him, methods of folding steel, tempering blades, balancing weight. An armor maker refined articulation based on long-standing design traditions. Siege engineers learned from chronicles of earlier campaigns. Innovation was layered onto memory. This layering allowed progress without rupture. Even as gunpowder gradually altered warfare, older forms remained embedded within new systems. The pike and arquebus operated side by side. Castles were modified rather than abandoned outright. The persistence of familiar tools alongside emerging technologies reveals a mindset grounded in caution and respect for proven reliability. The medieval period also demonstrates how innovation often begins at the margins. Local conflicts forced communities to experiment with available materials. Resource scarcity demanded efficiency. A region lacking heavy cavalry might invest more deeply in infantry discipline. A coastal power dependent on trade might prioritize naval armament. Over time, these localized solutions traveled outward, influencing broader practice. There is also an unmistakable environmental awareness embedded in medieval weapon design. Timber selection mattered. Metal purity mattered. Powder composition mattered. Climate and terrain shaped tactical choice. Creativity was never detached from material reality. It was intimately tied to it. We should also remember that medieval societies understood the psychological dimension of warfare. The presence of imposing siege engines or disciplined formations could influence outcomes before combat fully unfolded. Reputation became a weapon in itself. Creative arms, therefore, contributed to deterrence and negotiation as much as to battle. As centuries progressed, administrative capacity expanded. Monarchies and city-states began to centralize arsenals and standardize production. This shift did not replace craftsmanship. It organized it. The ability to equip larger forces consistently marked a turning point. Innovation became scalable. Yet through every transformation, the same principle remained. Observe, adapt, refine. Medieval weapon development was not chaotic invention. It was disciplined experimentation. It recognized that no solution was final. Every defense could be tested. Every tool could be improved. When we look back at the halberd's carefully proportioned head, the crossbow's mechanical leverage, the trebuchet's calculated counterweight, or the reinforced barrel of an early cannon, we are seeing more than instruments of war. We are seeing evidence of a culture committed to practical intelligence. The Middle Ages were not frozen in technological darkness. They were illuminated by workshops, by training fields, by stone fortifications adjusted brick by brick. They were shaped by communities who learned from hardship and applied those lessons steadily. And so, as we close this extended meditation on creative weapons of the medieval era, what remains is not the noise of battle, but the quiet rhythm of refinement. A civilization confronting uncertainty with patience. 1,000 years of incremental improvement. In that persistence, measured, pragmatic, and deeply human, we find the true legacy of medieval creativity. As we arrive at the final, unhurried conclusion of this long exploration, it becomes clear that the creative weapons of the medieval era were never simply about force. They were about continuity in the face of disruption. Across centuries marked by invasion, dynastic struggle, famine, religious upheaval, and plague, medieval societies did something remarkably consistent. They adapted carefully. Weapons changed not because novelty was desirable, but because necessity demanded adjustment. One of the defining traits of medieval innovation was its realism. No weapon was assumed to be perfect. Armor reduced vulnerability, but it introduced weight and fatigue. Cavalry delivered shock, but depended on terrain and discipline. Artillery broke walls, but required transport, powder, and skilled crews. Every advancement brought new complications. Medieval thinkers understood this balance instinctively. Creativity was not about erasing weakness entirely. It was about managing it more effectively than before. This perspective explains why medieval weapon evolution was so often incremental rather than revolutionary. A sword's profile narrowed slightly to improve thrusting. A halberd's hook was shaped for better leverage. A trebuchet's counterweight was recalibrated for consistency. A cannon's barrel was thickened to reduce risk of rupture. Each change might seem modest, but over generations these refinements accumulated into transformative shifts. What is especially important is that these refinements were grounded in observation. Medieval innovation was empirical. Blacksmiths judged temperature by the color of metal. Engineers learned from collapsed structures. Commanders adjusted formations based on muddy fields or broken lines. Knowledge was stored not in laboratories but in practice. It was embodied. Even the relationship between offense and defense reveals this measured intelligence. As fortifications improved, so did siege technologies. As plate armor spread among elites, so did impact weapons and thrust-oriented blades. As gunpowder weapons matured, defensive architecture evolved into angled bastions capable of absorbing artillery fire. At no stage did one side achieve permanent dominance. Instead, there was ongoing recalibration. This constant recalibration shaped political development as well. The growing importance of artillery and standardized infantry formations encouraged the expansion of centralized authority. Monarchies that could finance powder production and maintain permanent arsenals strengthened their control. Administrative organization became inseparable from military innovation. Creativity extended into governance. Yet even as states centralized, the medieval tradition of craftsmanship remained vital. A cannon could not exist without miners extracting or smelters refining metal, founders casting barrels, carpenters constructing carriages, and gunners trained in operation. Innovation was never solitary. It was communal, layered across trades and regions. Geography reinforced diversity in weapon development. Coastal republics invested heavily in naval armament and shipborne artillery. Mountainous regions favored mobility and lighter equipment. Open plains shaped cavalry tactics until disciplined infantry altered the equation. The medieval world did not produce a single, uniform system of warfare. Produced adaptive variations. There is also a psychological dimension that deserves recognition. The visible presence of disciplined formations, imposing siege engines, or newly integrated firearms could alter negotiations before conflict escalated. Reputation became an extension of armament. Creative weapons influenced diplomacy as much as battle. Perhaps the most revealing insight is that medieval societies did not pursue innovation for spectacle. They pursued reliability. A weapon that functioned consistently under real conditions was more valuable than one that dazzled. Practicality filtered design. Forms that endured did so because they balanced power with maintainability. And yet, despite centuries of refinement, the medieval world never reached a point of final security. Every solution invited a new problem. This ongoing tension fostered humility. No fortress was impregnable. No armor invulnerable. No engine unstoppable. The only constant was adaptation. When we look back now at the halberd, the longbow, the crossbow, the trebuchet, the early cannon, and the countless variations between them, we are not simply observing relics of conflict. We are witnessing 1,000 years of disciplined problem-solving. Iron shaped by careful hands. Timber balanced against gravity. Powder measured with caution. Formations drilled until cohesion became instinct. The Middle Ages, often misunderstood as static, reveal themselves instead as dynamic and responsive. Creative weapons were visible expressions of that responsiveness. They embodied a civilization learning steadily from its challenges. And so, as we finally close this extended study, the lasting image is not dramatic conquest, but patient refinement. Generations improving what they inherited. Communities adjusting to shifting realities. A culture that understood survival as an ongoing responsibility. In that quiet persistence, pragmatic, cumulative, and profoundly human, we find the enduring legacy of creative weapons in the medieval era. As we settle into the true final reflection of this long documentary journey, it is worth stepping back from the individual weapons themselves and considering what they reveal about the rhythm of medieval life. The creative weapons of the medieval era were not sudden sparks in an otherwise static age. They were steady pulses within a society constantly adjusting to instability. War was frequent, but so too were harvests, trade, construction, worship, and governance. Weapons were shaped in the same workshops that produced tools for farming and building. Innovation was not isolated inside battlefields. It was woven into daily existence. Across roughly 1,000 years, medieval Europe and its neighboring regions experienced dramatic change. Empires fragmented and reassembled. Trade routes expanded. Populations rose, then fell sharply during crises like the Black Death. Through all of this, weapon design evolved quietly, persistently. The spear of the early Middle Ages, simple and reliable, remained recognizable centuries later, but its context changed. The knight's mail hauberk gradually gave way to articulated plate. Wooden palisades evolved into concentric stone fortifications. Traction trebuchets became counterweight machines of remarkable consistency. Early hand cannons matured into organized field artillery. The pace was slow, but the direction was unmistakable. Adaptation through refinement. What defines medieval weapon creativity most clearly is its grounded practicality. No innovation emerged for spectacle alone. Every alteration addressed a tangible problem. Armor grew more sophisticated because existing protection had proven insufficient. Polearms diversified because infantry required tools that could manage mounted opponents. Crossbows flourished because they offered mechanical advantage in a world where training time and manpower varied. Gunpowder was integrated not out of fascination with novelty, but because its force could alter siege outcomes. This pragmatic spirit also shaped restraint. Medieval societies rarely discarded proven systems without cause. Older weapons coexisted with newer ones for generations. Bows and firearms shared the battlefield. Pikes shielded arquebusiers. Swords remained sidearms even as artillery expanded in influence. The willingness to layer innovation rather than replace tradition outright reflects caution rooted in lived experience. Equally important is the communal nature of medieval innovation. No single craft existed in isolation. A siege engine required carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, laborers, and overseers. A cannon depended on mining operations, metallurgical expertise, casting facilities, and trained gunners. Even a well-balanced sword reflected the collaboration of miners, smelters, smiths, and leatherworkers. Creativity was distributed across networks of skill. Administrative growth in the later medieval period reinforced this interconnectedness. As monarchies and city-states established permanent arsenals, they introduced systems of record-keeping, storage, and standardized production. Logistics became a discipline. The ability to maintain supply lines and consistent equipment shaped the outcome of campaigns as much as battlefield bravery. Innovation expanded from physical objects into organizational structure. Geography ensured diversity. Coastal republics prioritized naval weaponry and shipboard adaptations. Mountain communities favored mobility. Plains encouraged cavalry until disciplined infantry challenged that dominance. In each region, creative weapons reflected terrain and climate as much as politics. Yet through all variation, a single pattern remains constant: humility before limitation. Medieval people understood that no wall was invulnerable, no armor flawless, no formation unbreakable. Every solution was temporary. This recognition fostered continuous vigilance. When artillery threatened stone walls, engineers redesigned fortifications with angled bastions and reinforced earthworks. When armor restricted movement, articulation improved. When gunpowder misfired, mixtures were refined. The creative weapons of the medieval era therefore stand as artifacts of disciplined persistence. They were not products of blind faith in progress, but of careful observation. Metal was judged by color in the forge. Timber was selected by grain and strength. Counterweights were tested repeatedly until arcs stabilized. Powder was measured cautiously. Training fields echoed with repetition until formations moved as one. In the end, what these weapons reveal is not merely how medieval societies fought, but how they thought. They thought in terms of adjustment. They valued durability over extravagance. They learned from failure and passed those lessons forward. Over centuries, that steady process reshaped entire systems of warfare and governance. So as we finally close this exploration of creative weapons in the medieval era, what remains is a quiet image. Generations at work. Craftsmen refining steel. Engineers balancing gravity. Soldiers drilling in disciplined lines. Communities adapting to pressure without abandoning continuity. The Middle Ages were not frozen in time. They were defined by motion, measured, practical, cumulative motion. And in that steady rhythm of refinement, we find the enduring legacy of medieval creativity, a profoundly human commitment to observe, adapt, and endure.